Before we begin, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop, your jaw unclench, and your eyes soften. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, you're safe now. Welcome back to this quiet corner of history, where the past whispers softly and bedtime stories wear chainmail. If this is your first visit, I'm glad you're here, and if you're returning, welcome home. Now, before we saddle up and ride into tonight's tale, I'd love if you could do something small that means a lot. Hit that like button, share the story with someone who loves a good bedtime detour, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss tomorrow's special chapter. In the comments, let me know where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I read every message, and it helps this sleepy little community feel a little less far apart. Tonight, let me take you far from the castles, far from battlefields soaked in legend and blood. Tonight, we begin in the quiet, green folds of the countryside, where a boy named Elric grew up beneath the rustle of orchard trees and the warmth of forge fire. He was not royal, not poor, just enough. Just enough to have bread on the table and time to dream of horses, armor, and being more than the world expected. He was 10 when he met a real knight, a man with dust on his boots and dents in his armor. He stayed just one night and said nothing, but his eyes met Elric's for a breathless moment. And from that second on, the boy was never the same. He began to train in secret. He ran until his legs ached, carved a wooden sword from a tree branch, and listened to the war stories of a bitter old drunk who once held a spear with pride. No one knew he was preparing. No one saw the boy who whispered to chickens like they were his army, who tied cloth into his tunic to feel the weight of imagined armor. But one day, at just 13, he left. He walked barefoot across 25 miles of dirt and stone without a goodbye. And when the castle guards laughed, he didn't flinch. He didn't plead. He just looked them in the eyes, and they stopped laughing. Because Elric wasn't special, he was determined. And that is where our story truly begins. By the time Elric stepped through the castle gates, the sun had descended below the hills, casting long shadows across the training yard. His feet were blistered, his throat dry, and the hem of his tunic was stiff with dust and sweat. But he didn't stop. He didn't sit. He just stood in the courtyard of a world he'd only ever imagined, looking up at towers that seemed to scrape the sky. And for a moment, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. But then a voice barked across the stone. "Who are you?" Elric turned to see a guard, tall and grizzled, armor clinking with every step. "I'm here to become a page," Elric said. The guard snorted. "With those shoes and that face?" The others laughed, a mean, tired kind of laughter. Elric said nothing. He just looked the man in the eye like he'd looked at the knight years before. That silence, complete of defiance and something else, something older than his years, made the laughter die in their throats. They didn't take him in because he was noble. They didn't take him in because he had pedigree, armor, or letters from someone important. They took him in because he didn't ask for permission to belong. Elric became a page. He slept in a room with 5 other boys, all older, all stronger, and none particularly welcoming. His bed was a straw mat on a wooden frame. His pillow was his cloak, rolled tight and lumpy. He missed his mother's voice, how she used to hum while shaping dough. He missed the trees behind his home that whispered secrets when the wind came through. But there was no room for longing here. He rose before the sun, swept ash from hearths, and polished armor until his fingers bled. He learned when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. He was invisible, and he watched everything. He saw how knights stood when resting, not squires used circular motions when cleaning shields, and how the best fighters never bragged, shouted, or needed to be noticed. He noticed. For weeks, he did not touch a sword, not even a wooden one. He cleaned them, sure, wiped the blood from their grooves, oiled the blades, and sharpened edges with a rhythm that became part of his breath. But they were not his to hold. Until one day, he was summoned to the practice yard. Sir Alden stood there, waiting. A knight not tall, not flashy, but with a presence that bent the air around him. When he moved, the other squires fell silent. He didn't shout, he didn't praise, he just expected. He tossed Elric a wooden sword. "Swing," he said. Elric gripped the hilt, his palms already sweating. He swung. Too wide, too slow. Sir Alden said nothing, just watched. Again, and again, and again. When Elric lunged forward and lost his footing, collapsing into the dirt, Sir Alden finally spoke. Fall in battle once, you'll remember. The lesson was brutal and daily. Sir Alden never raised his voice, never offered comfort. But when, after weeks of failure, Elric landed his first clean strike in a sparring match, the knight gave him a single word: good. And that word lit Elric's chest like a hearth fire on a winter morning. He trained at dawn, trained at dusk, and sparred with squires who mocked him, bruised his ribs, and split his lip. He never complained, never stopped. He learned that pain wasn't an enemy, it was a language, a warning sometimes, a teacher often. When the others went to eat, he stayed back to repeat forms until his muscles shook. He didn't dream anymore, not in the way he had as a boy. There were no fantasies of golden armor or parades, just steel, cold, silent steel. And in that silence, something inside him settled, not a resignation, but a clarity. One rainy morning, a woman arrived at the castle. Older, sharp-eyed, wearing a pendant the color of starlight. She watched the squire train, said nothing, and then pointed at Elric. "That one," she said to the steward, "send him." He didn't know where. I didn't ask. The next day, he rode out with 3 other squires, older, broader, louder. They were assigned to guard a merchant caravan heading toward the coast. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't what he'd imagined when he first dreamed of shining armor. But it was real. He rode in the rain, slept in barns. I ate cold bread with frozen fingers, chased away thieves who were more hungry than dangerous. He learned how to fake confidence and stand like he knew what he was doing, even when he didn't. And when they returned, the merchant handed each squire a coin and said, looking at Elric, "You didn't run." That meant more to him than any medal could. When Elric was 16, he saw war for the first time, not from a hero's saddle, but from the side, holding reins, carrying water, delivering orders with shaking hands. The field reeked of blood, steel, and something else. Something like fear soaked in history. He saw Sir Alden ride into the chaos like he was born from it. He watched soldiers fall, rise, and fall again. Elric didn't fight that day, but he carried a wounded man back to the carts. The soldier looked up at him, blood pouring from his leg, and whispered, "Did I do something worth remembering?" Elric nodded, lied. Yes, the man died before sunset. That night, Elric sat under a tree, washing his hands repeatedly. But they still felt wet. Sir Alden found him, sat beside him without a word. After a long while, he said, "A sword is the last thing a knight should be known for." Elric didn't understand, not yet, but he remembered. It would stay with him. In the years to come, when he was no longer just a boy with a wooden sword, but something more. This was not the end of his journey. It was only the edge of the blade. Winter came early that year, the kind of winter that didn't knock. It barged in, soaked the floors, and settled into your bones like unpaid rent. Elric, now 17, had grown taller, stronger, and quieter. His frame had filled out, not with bulk, but with something lean and deliberate, like a blade sharpened by weather, time, and disappointment. He didn't smile much. He didn't need to. There was a steadiness in him now, a stillness that came not from peace, but from carrying weight the world didn't see. One morning, without warning, the castle master summoned him. No explanation, just a curt nod and a gesture toward the stables. There, waiting for him, was a horse. Not a war horse, not the majestic steed of songs and banners. This one was scrappy, brown with patches of white, her left ear torn, her back scarred with old lashes. Her name was Myra. She looked at Elric like she didn't trust him, and to be fair, he wasn't so sure he trusted her either. Their first ride was a disaster. She pulled left, stopped without warning, and backed up when he nudged her forward. Some squires laughed. One even muttered, "Better off walking." But Elric didn't yank the reins or shout. He didn't punish. He just whispered, held steady, and waited. By the end of the week, she moved in with him. Not because he forced her, but because he listened. This, he realized, was what knighthood felt like. Not commanding, not conquering, but connecting and trusting something or someone who owed you nothing. And so he rode, not often into glory, but into mud, rain, and days where nothing heroic happened. He learned how to navigate roads swallowed by fog, calm villagers panicked by shadows in the woods, and negotiate with merchants who wouldn't stop talking long enough to hear a warning. He carried letters between lords, delivered medicine to plague-touched farms, and once quietly sat beside a dying child so their parents could rest. No armor. No songs, just presence. He never boasted. He didn't keep tally, but others noticed. One day, the steward called him again, this time to stand before the lord of the castle. The hall was quiet, sunlight spilling through stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in fractured color. "What do you want?" the lord asked, eyes narrowed. Elric didn't hesitate. To serve. Not to rise? If rising does not serve, it isn't rising. There was a pause. Somewhere behind the lord, someone chuckled. Another voice scribbled something onto parchment. Later that day, Sir Alden found him by the stables. "That answer?" he said. "They'll remember it." But Elric didn't want to be remembered. He tried to be good, and being good, he was learning, took a lot longer. So he began to teach. No one told him to. No title was given. But he remembered what it felt like to be overlooked. The boy in the corner with nothing but dreams and a splintered stick. He started with one younger page. I showed him how to hold a blade without gripping it like fear. Then another, and another. He didn't just teach them how to fight. He taught them how to see, to listen before they acted, to recognize fear not as a weakness but as a signal, to speak only when they meant it, and to stand quietly when words would break more than they fixed. One night, by the fire, a boy asked him, "What's the hardest part?" Elric stared into the flames for a long time. "Coming home," he said finally. The boy didn't understand. That was okay. He would, someday. A few weeks later, on what should have been a routine patrol through the northern woods, Elric and 3 others were ambushed. The attackers came at dawn, silent, fast, coordinated. Bandits, maybe deserters, maybe something worse. It didn't matter. Swords clashed, horses screamed. Elric felt the cut across his shoulder before he even saw the blade. But he didn't stop. He didn't check the wound. He kept fighting, not for victory, but to keep the others alive. He took down 2 attackers, shielded the youngest squire when he stumbled, and dragged a wounded comrade behind a fallen log. By the time it was over, Elric collapsed face first into the frost. Everything went black. He woke up 3 days later in the castle infirmary. His shoulder was bandaged. His body was weak. Sir Alden was sitting at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, silent. "You didn't leave anyone behind," was all he said. Elric slept again. When he woke the second time, the bed was empty beside him, but on the table, folded neatly, was a piece of cloth. Inside it, a note. 4 words. "You are still here." There was no name, no signature, just that simple truth written in a hand he didn't recognize. He kept the cloth, always. Tucked inside his armor, close to his heart. It wasn't a banner. It wasn't for show. But it reminded him that survival was a kind of knighthood, too. Spring came late, dragging its heels through the thaw. The fields turned green again, the trees shook off their frost, and the castle bell rang with unusual urgency. Elric was summoned once more, this time to kneel. Not for punishment, not for the task, but for the honor. He knelt in the great hall, sunlight warm on his back, as the lord approached with a ceremonial blade. The room was packed, but it felt quiet. The sword touched his left shoulder. Then he was right. And as the words of the oath echoed around him, all Elric could hear was the memory of his father's voice. "You'll be strong enough someday, just not today." And now today had finally come. He was strong enough not because he took power, but because he had learned to carry it without hurting those beneath it. When he stood, the title rang out, Sir Elric, and for a moment he didn't move. The word didn't feel like a crown, it felt like armor, heavy, earned, a sound shaped by others, now worn by him. The first time someone called him Sir Elric in public, he almost didn't turn around. Not because he didn't hear it, but because it didn't feel like it belonged to him. The word carried weight not just in sound, but in memory. It echoed with the scrape of steel on stone, the soft breath of his mother humming in a quiet kitchen, and the hollow ache of carrying a dying man off a battlefield. Sir wasn't shiny. It wasn't smooth. It was heavy, like the sword he had once feared to touch. Still, the title stuck, and so did the responsibility. Knighthood wasn't a prize, it was a promise. One Elric carried with a kind of quiet ferocity, like a candle in a storm. There were no parades, no banquets in his honor, just new orders, new dangers, and a new cloak, black with silver trim that made peasants stop and bow, even when all he wanted was to help lift a broken cart from the mud. His first mission as a knight came sooner than expected. A border town had gone silent. No messengers, no travelers, no trade. Whispers said it was bandits, others blamed wolves. The castle steward handed him a scroll, sealed in wax and urgency. "You'll go alone," he said. "You move faster that way." Alone. The word didn't scare him. but it did make him think. He packed light. His sword, a dagger, some dried meat, and the cloth with 4 words folded carefully inside his tunic. "You are still here." Myra, his battle-scarred mare, seemed to understand the gravity of it all. She didn't fight the saddle. They didn't protest the road, just moved silent and sure through the gray mist that hung over the hills like a held breath. It took 3 days to reach the town. What he found wasn't raided. It wasn't burned. It was abandoned. Shutters hung open, doors swung lazily on rusted hinges, carts were half loaded. A meal sat on one table, untouched, the bread molded and hard. Chickens clucked in confusion. A dog barked once, then fled into the woods. But there were no people, no bodies, no signs of struggle. Just silence. Elric dismounted and moved slowly through the village. His boots echoed on stone. He called out once, twice, no answer. A strange stillness wrapped around the place, as if the town held its breath, afraid to exhale. He spent the night in the chapel, lit a candle, waited. In the early hours, just before dawn, he heard it. A cry, not human, not animal, something between. He followed the sound through the fog, past the empty mill, and down into the root-thick ground of the forest beyond. And there, in a hollow too perfect to be natural, he found them. The townspeople, dozens of them. Huddled together, eyes wide with fear, mouths bound with cloth, children clung to their mothers, men clenched rusted farming tools. They were alive, but barely. Guarding them were figures cloaked in dark green, faces covered in ash and leaves. Forest men, outlaws once driven from the land for refusing to kneel. Now they ruled this place in silence and shadow. One of them stepped forward, no sword, just a staff. "You're not dressed like a tax collector," the man said. "I'm not," Elric replied. "I'm here because your neighbors thought you were dead." The outlaw didn't blink. Better they think that. Safer. Elric looked around. The people weren't hostages. They were hiding and protecting the forest men as much as they were protecting them. And just like that, the story changed. This wasn't a rescue. It was a reckoning. The man told Elric what had happened, how the local lord had tripled taxes, how anyone who couldn't pay was dragged from their homes, their land seized, how one woman was beaten for hiding grain, how the town decided it was better to vanish than to live under boots and coin. "They call it rebellion," the man said, "but it's just survival." Elric listened. He didn't argue, he didn't threaten. He asked for names, he asked for proof, and then he left. When he returned to the castle, mud on his cloak and smoke still in his hair, he handed the steward a list. "What's this?" the man asked. "Crimes," Elric replied, "but not theirs." The following days were tense. The lord was furious, accused Elric of treason, of weakness, of listening too much. But Sir Alden, still watching, always silent, stood beside him. Said nothing, just stood. In the end, nothing was done publicly. The taxes were lowered. The soldiers stopped going near the woods. Quietly, the town returned. Quietly, Elric returned to patrol. But word spread. There was a knight who listened before he judged and stood still, even when the world told him to swing. As he tended to Myra in the stables one evening, a young page approached him, nervous, barely older than Elric had been when he first walked into the castle, covered in dust and dreams. "Sir Elric?" the boy asked. "Yes? Is it true you once fought off an entire army with nothing but a dagger?" Elric smiled, not because it was true, but because the boy needed the myth more than the fact. "No," he said, "it was a spoon." The boy's eyes widened, and Elric let him keep the wonder. Because sometimes being a knight wasn't about truth, it was about hope. Back in his chamber that night, he lit a candle, unfolded the cloth, and reread the words. "You are still here." And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe maybe being here was exactly what the world needed. The days that followed were quieter, but the silence wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that waits, that watches, that measures you. Sir Elric rode more extended patrols now, deeper into the outlying regions, villages you wouldn't find on any map, roads where wheel ruts disappeared into the grass, and places where people greeted knights not with awe but suspicion. He understood why. Armor to them didn't mean safety. It meant taxes, swords, and bad news. Elric didn't wear the full plate much anymore. It slowed him down and made him look too much like the men who took more than they gave. Instead, he rode in a simple tunic over chainmail, the crest on his chest covered by a faded cloak. He didn't correct those who called him traveler, messenger, or that quiet one with the haunted eyes. He wasn't there to impress, he was there to see. and he saw everything. A girl stood guard outside a hut while her mother gave birth inside. A man repairing the same wheel on the same cart for what had to be the 5th time. A blind dog barking at shadows and still earning a place by the fire. Small things, but Elric had learned that the most minor things were usually the most telling. He stopped at a village near the marshlands one evening. Barely a dozen homes, a well, and a crooked church that looked like it had grown from the mud rather than been built on it. The villagers eyed him like he might ask for a coin or conscription. Instead, he asked for soup, and when it came, he thanked them, sat by their fire, and listened. They spoke of disappearances, of shadows that moved in the fog, of people gone missing near the old well that no one used anymore. Elric didn't laugh, I didn't scoff. He knew better than dismissing fear because it sounded like a tale to scare children. That night, while others slept, he went to the well. The fog was thick, cold as breath on steel. The well was old, older than the church, older than the village. The stones were slick with moss, and the wooden cover had rotted through in places. He circled it and listened, and heard nothing, which was wrong. Even the insects had gone silent. He drew his dagger, not his sword. The dagger had always been quieter, faster, more honest. The weapon you used when no one was watching. There were tracks, barefoot, scattered, half melted into the mud. He followed them deeper into the marsh. Myra waited behind, her reins tied loosely to a bent tree. She didn't like the air, neither did Elric. The trees changed as he moved, grew thicker, closer. The fog wasn't just mist anymore, it was heavy, like wet cloth pressing against his skin. And then he heard it, a whisper. Not a word, not a name, just a sound like breath pulled backward. He followed it, step by step, and that's when he found the boy. 12, maybe. Dirty, thin, eyes wide with a kind of terror that didn't come from nightmares, but from seeing something you weren't meant to see. Elric knelt and lowered his weapon. The boy didn't speak, just pointed. Elric turned and saw the old stones. Not a ruin, not quite. More like bones of a building the forest had forgotten to bury. There were markings on the wall, faded, carved deep, symbols from an older time, and in the center a door, half open. Because of course there was. Elric didn't hesitate, he didn't charge either, he just walked forward, slow, steady, quiet. Inside, the air was colder, not damp, not rotted, just cold, like the breath of something ancient and patient. The chamber was round, candles burned along the edge, fresh, lit recently. And in the center, standing like a priest at the altar, was a man in robes too clean for the marsh. He turned and his smile was wrong, too wide, too knowing. "Another night," he said. "Come to silence what he doesn't understand." "I'm not here to silence anything," Elric replied. "I'm here because children are disappearing." The man laughed. "They come willingly. They seek truth, power, freedom from the cages you call law." Elric stepped closer. "Then why are they afraid?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Because the truth is frightening." "Not like this," Elric said. "Not in the dark." There was a sound behind him, more figures, robed, young, some barely more than boys and girls, eyes blank, steps unsure. Magic wasn't supposed to be real, not like this. But Elric had long stopped assuming what the world should be. He only cared what it was. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't make threats. He spoke to them. "You're not weak for being afraid. You're human. Real strength isn't running from the dark. It's walking through it and knowing when to turn back." A girl stepped forward, then another. The spell, whatever it was, cracked, shattered. The man shouted, light flared, and Elric moved. The fight was fast, ugly, no style, no elegance, just instinct, grit, and the sharp kiss of steel. When it ended, the candles were out. The robed man lay still. The children stared at Elric, blinking like they'd just woken from a long sleep. He led them back to the village, said nothing about what happened. "I just made sure they got home." And then he rode on. Word of what happened spread, as it always did. They said Sir Elric had faced a cult that he'd banished a demon. They made songs that he'd walked into the fog and came out untouched. Drew symbols, told stories, but Elric never spoke of it, because he hadn't gone there to be remembered. He went because someone had to, because titles don't make you brave, actions do. And sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't facing monsters in the dark, it's believing people can still come back from it. They say a knight is measured not by how he fights, but by what he walks away from. Weeks passed since Elric had led those children from the fog, Since he'd stepped into a ruin humming with old magic and older lies, he returned with nothing but silence to offer. He didn't carry trophies, didn't write reports, didn't carve his name into the stones. He just rode back to the castle, cleaned the mud from his boots, and tended to Myra with a cloth soaked in warm water and quiet thoughts. But the world can echo your footsteps when you think you're alone. Stories began to circle, tales of the knight who didn't kill unless he had to, the one who spoke softly, listened thoroughly, and rode into trouble like he was born. They called him the Still Blade. Not because he didn't swing his sword, but because when he did, it was only after every other option had bled dry. He never liked the nickname. Still, it followed him, and so did the expectations. One gray morning, as clouds dragged across the sky like a torn curtain, the castle bell rang 3 times, slow and heavy. A summons, urgent. Elric finished his meal, wiped his hands, and followed the sound. Inside the main hall, the air was thick with tension. Lords, stewards, captains, and at the center of it all, a map. A village had vanished, not abandoned, not overrun, vanished. A scout had ridden through 3 days prior. They said it looked fine. Smoke from chimneys, carts in motion, children playing with hoops. He left to deliver a message. When he came back the next morning, it was gone. The buildings were still there, but the people, all of them, gone. No signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks, just silence. Again, Elric didn't speak, just nodded and rode. The journey took him through hills soaked in autumn gold, forests whose branches arched like ribs overhead, and valleys where even the birds held their breath. When he reached the village, he stopped at the edge, just outside the gate. It was exactly as described. Houses intact, lanterns still swinging in the breeze, a stew pot boiling over in one kitchen, now blackened and crusted, a dog lying in the road, unmoving but not harmed, no burn marks, no battle signs, just stillness. He stepped inside. Every door creaked like it was trying to whisper something. Every chair was tipped slightly as if someone had stood up in a hurry, or not at all. Elric checked the beds, all made, checked the stables, horses still tied but restless. He checked the chapel. That's where he found the first clue. On the wall behind the altar was a symbol he'd seen once before. Back in the marsh. Not the same, but close. A swirling pattern of lines, curved like water, sharp like blades. He touched it. The stone beneath felt warm. That's when the whispering began. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even distinct, just a murmur that pressed against the inside of his skull like the wind behind a sealed door. He stepped back. He drew his dagger, not because he expected it to help, but because it helped him focus. Not again, he muttered. The whisper grew louder. Not words, not voices. Just pressure. He moved through the village, following the feeling like a hunter chasing a scent. Past the inn, past the well to the largest house near the square, the mayor's home by the look of it. Inside it was colder. In the center of the floor was a circle, drawn in ash. Around it 6 chairs, all empty. Candles melted to nubs. A book lay open on the table, its pages charred but not consumed. He picked it up, read what he could. To speak with those beyond the veil, one must first forget the sound of their voice. He didn't like that. At all. He stepped back. That's when he heard a sound that didn't fit, the creak of a board upstairs. Not wind, not memory, something real. He moved fast, quiet, blade drawn. At the top of the stairs, he found a boy, barely more than 10, wrapped in blankets, eyes wide, lips moving without sound. He was mouthing a name, Elric. The knight froze. "How do you know me?" he asked. The boy blinked, then whispered, "They told me." Elric knelt beside him. "Who?" The boy trembled. "They're everywhere now, Sfro, under the skin of the village, in the corners. They said you came before, that you stopped the door, but this time it's open." Elric didn't hesitate. He lifted the boy, carried him outside, past the well, past the silent dog, back to the edge of the village where Myra waited. The horse stamped nervously, her eyes fixed on something behind Elric. He turned, and the village was changing, not crumbling, not burning, shifting, like it was forgetting how to be a village. Roofs curved where they shouldn't. Walls stretched like wax in heat. The church bell rang once, then inverted, folding into itself like paper. Elric mounted with the boy in front of him. They kicked Myra hard. They rode. And behind them, the village sighed, collapsed inward with a sound like breath leaving a chest. And then there was nothing. No ruins, no fire. Just grass, flat, empty, clean. He didn't return to the castle right away. He brought the boy to a monastery where the monks knew how to tend to things that didn't appear on maps or in medical scrolls. He stayed long enough to see the boy sleep peacefully, then left a note. If he wakes, tell him, some doors don't need locks. They need someone to stand in front of them. When Elric finally returned, they asked what he saw. He didn't answer. But that night, he took out the cloth, creased now, stained with time, unfolded it, "You are still here," and whispered back, "So is the dark, but not tonight." They say a knight is measured not by how he fights, but by what he walks away from. Weeks passed since Elric had led those children from the fog, since he'd stepped into a ruin humming with old magic and older lies. He returned with nothing but silence to offer. He didn't carry trophies, didn't write reports, didn't carve his name into the stones. He just rode back to the castle, cleaned the mud from his boots, and tended to Myra with a cloth soaked in warm water and quiet thoughts. But the world can echo your footsteps when you think you're alone. Stories began to circle, tales of the knight who didn't kill unless he had to, the one who spoke softly, listened thoroughly, and rode into trouble like he was born. They called him the Still Blade, not because he didn't swing his sword, but because when he did, it was only after every other option had bled dry. He never liked the nickname. Still, it followed him, and so did the expectations. One gray morning, as clouds dragged across the sky like a torn curtain, the castle bell rang 3 times, slow and heavy. A summons. Urgent. Elric finished his meal, wiped his hands, and followed the sound. Inside the main hall, the air was thick with tension. Lords, stewards, captains, and at the center of it all, a map. A village had vanished, not abandoned, not overrun, vanished. A scout had ridden through 3 days prior. They said it looked fine. Smoke from chimneys, carts in motion, children playing with hoops. He left to deliver a message. When he came back the next morning, it was gone. The buildings were still there. But the people, all of them, gone. No signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks, just silence. Again, Elric didn't speak, just nodded and rode. The journey took him through hills soaked in autumn gold and forests whose branches arched like ribs overhead, and valleys where even the birds held their breath. When he reached the village, he stopped at the edge, just outside the gate. It was exactly as described. Houses intact, lanterns still swinging in the breeze, a stew pot boiling over in one kitchen, now blackened and crusted, a dog lying in the road, unmoving but not harmed, no burn marks, no battle signs, just stillness. He stepped inside. Every door creaked like it was trying to whisper something. Every chair was tipped slightly as if someone had stood up in a hurry, or not at all. Elric checked the beds, all made, checked the stables, horses still tied but restless. He checked the chapel. That's where he found the first clue. On the wall, behind the altar, was a symbol he'd seen once before, back in the marsh. Not the same, but close. A swirling pattern of lines, curved like water, sharp like blades. He touched it. The stone beneath felt warm. That's when the whispering began. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even distinct, just a murmur that pressed against the inside of his skull, like the wind behind a sealed door. He stepped back. He drew his dagger, not because he expected it to help, but because it helped him focus. "Not again," he muttered. The whisper grew louder. Not words, not voices, just pressure. He moved through the village, following the feeling like a hunter chasing a scent. Past the inn, past the well, to the largest house near the square. The mayor's home, by the look of it. Inside it was colder. In the center of the floor was a circle, drawn in ash. Around it, 6 chairs, all empty. Candles melted to nubs. A book lay open on the table, its pages charred but not consumed. He picked it up, read what he could. To speak with those beyond the veil, one must first forget the sound of their voice. He didn't like that, at all. He stepped back. That's when he heard a sound that didn't fit, the creak of a board upstairs. Not wind, not memory, something real. He moved fast, quiet, blade drawn. At the top of the stairs, he found a boy, barely more than 10, wrapped in blankets, eyes wide, lips moving without sound. He was mouthing a name. "Elric," the knight froze. "How do you know me?" he asked. The boy blinked, then whispered, "They told me." Elric knelt beside him. "Who?" The boy trembled. "They're everywhere now, when under the skin of the village, in the corners. They said you came before, that you stopped the door. But this time, it's open." Elric didn't hesitate. He lifted the boy, carried him outside, past the well, past the silent dog, back to the edge of the village where Myra waited. The horse stamped nervously, her eyes fixed on something behind Elric. He turned, and the village was changing. Not crumbling, not burning, shifting, like it was forgetting how to be a village. Roofs curved where they shouldn't, walls stretched like wax in heat. The church bell rang once, then inverted, folding into itself like paper. Elric mounted with the boy in front of him. They kicked Myra hard, they rode, and behind them the village sighed, collapsed inward with a sound like breath leaving a chest. And then there was nothing, no ruins, no fire, just grass, flat, empty, clean. He didn't return to the castle right away. He brought the boy to a monastery where the monks knew how to tend to things that didn't appear on maps or in medical scrolls. He stayed long enough to see the boy sleep peacefully, then left a note. If he wakes, tell him, some doors don't need locks. They need someone to stand in front of them. When Elric finally returned, they asked what he saw. He didn't answer. But that night, he took out the cloth, creased now, stained with time, unfolded it. You are still here, and whispered back, so is the dark, but not tonight. The mirror was gone, but its weight lingered. Elric rode for hours after leaving the Seer's monastery, not because anyone asked him to, and not because he had a destination. He just rode. Myra galloped through dawn mist and midday wind, her hooves like drumbeats against the land. Elric didn't speak, didn't rest. The air felt heavier now, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. Nothing visible, nothing obvious, just off. And deep down he knew something had seen him. Not just in the mirror, but behind it, around it. Whatever it was, it hadn't been bound by the glass. It had simply chosen not to cross. Yet, he finally stopped near a river that ran quiet and cold beneath a canopy of pine. The water mirrored the sky. No cracks here, no whispers, just the soft murmur of nature doing its best to ignore the madness of man. He dismounted, removed his cloak, and stared at his reflection in the stream. He didn't look different, but he felt it. He still remembered the breath from the mirror, the word it had spoken. Not just his name, but the way it said it, like a verdict, like a prophecy. He splashed water on his face, trying to wash away the feeling. It didn't help. That night, under stars too bright to trust, he dreamed. The mirror again, but bigger, curved across the sky like a second moon. His reflection stood inside it, smiling, but the smile wasn't his. It was too wide, too sure. And behind that version of himself, shadows moved, hungry and slow. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, blade already drawn. But there was nothing, just trees, fog, and the ache in his chest that said this wasn't over. And it wasn't, because 3 days later, he was summoned again. This time by name, not by the steward, not by the court, by a stranger, a child. A girl of no more than 9, with a cloak too big for her shoulders and mud on her cheeks, walked into the outer yard of the castle, asked for Sir Elric, and when pressed said only this, he's the one they fear. No one knew what she meant, but Elric did. He met her by the fire, gave her bread, let her eat, then listened. She'd come from a village tucked near the borderlands, close to where strange lights had been seen in the sky, lights that didn't belong to stars or storms. People had started changing, she said. Not vanishing, changing, speaking in voices that weren't theirs, waking up in places they hadn't gone to sleep. One man had begun carving symbols into his own walls. Another had walked into the woods and come back without eyes, but said he could see more than ever. No one knew what to do, so she ran, and someone told her to find him. Elric didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He packed his gear, saddled Myra, told the steward he was leaving. No one tried to stop him. He reached the village by dusk the next day. It looked normal. Houses, fields, smoke from chimneys. But the quiet was different here. Not peaceful, watchful. Like the earth itself was waiting for someone to make the wrong sound. He dismounted, walked slowly. People watched from windows. No one greeted him, until a man stepped out from the inn, mid-40s, eyes sunken, voice too calm. You shouldn't have come. Elric tilted his head. Why not? Because it knows you. It remembers you. There it was again, the echo of the mirror. The feeling that the thing he'd faced hadn't been destroyed, only delayed, moved, shifted. Elric entered the inn, sat down, waited. The man poured him tea. No one else spoke. They just watched, and then, without warning, they began to hum, all of them, same tone, same rhythm. Elric's hand moved to his dagger. The air shimmered just for a second, like heat rising off stone. But it was cold inside. The hum stopped. Then from the fireplace, a voice. Not a growl, not a whisper. Just a voice. Familiar. Elric. He stood. The fire flared, shadows shifted, and from them a figure stepped out. Not made of flame, not smoke. Flesh. Real, tangible. It looked like him. Exactly like him. But older, tired, eyes sharp in ways that his never were. "I've waited," the thing said. "What are you?" Elric asked. The figure smiled. "What you could be if you stopped trying to save them." "I'm not here to become anything." "Then you're already halfway there." The figure moved, fast. Elric met it head-on. Steel clashed, sparks flew, but this wasn't like any duel he'd fought. This thing knew him. Every feint, every step, every breath. It mirrored his movements, anticipated them, until he stopped fighting, closed his eyes, listened, and moved wrong, intentionally, and that was the break. The copy faltered, just long enough. Elric stepped in, blade at its throat. It laughed. "Strike me down, and you'll be me." Elric lowered the blade. "No," he said, "I won't kill what's already dying." And the thing, it crumbled, not in agony, not in defeat, but in relief, like a mask finally allowed to fall. The villagers woke slowly, confused, crying, unaware of what had happened. The man at the inn asked him, "Was it a demon?" "No," Elric replied. "It was a choice." He didn't stay long. The girl followed him back to the road, handed him a drawing. Stick figures, a knight, a horse, a sun that looked more like a potato. He smiled. She said, "You're different than I thought." "Good different or bad different?" She shrugged. "Different." He rode away. Another crack sealed, but behind him in the woods something whispered. Another name, not his, but someone else's. Because the thing he faced wasn't just watching him, it was waking up others. The wind had changed, not in the way it shifts with seasons or storms. No, this change wasn't in the air, it was in the land itself. Elric felt it beneath Myra's hooves as they moved from village to village. The ground was still firm, the trees still stood, but something beneath the surface had begun to stir. And the whispering? It had spread. It wasn't just children now, or monks, or villagers on the fringe. The voices were showing up in places they never should have reached, near cities, on trade roads, in dreams that leaked into waking life. Men were sleepwalking with symbols burned into their arms. Merchants spoke in tongues they didn't know. Entire caravans stopped moving at sunset, eyes vacant, waiting for orders from no one. Elric wasn't chasing rumors anymore. He was following threads, and each one led him closer to a name he hadn't heard before, but which everyone seemed to know. The Pale Choir. No one claimed to be part of it, but everyone had heard of them. A gathering of voices, a song that wasn't sung but felt, something older than language, something that had no leader but always moved as one. And, according to whispers passed between guards and drunk scholars, it had started after the mirror cracked. Coincidence? Not a chance. Elric began mapping the places he'd been, the ones where the strange things had happened, the vanished town, the forest well, the cracked mirror, the children who spoke names they shouldn't know, and a pattern emerged, a spiral, growing wider, and at the center, his home. Not the castle, the orchard, the one he'd left as a boy all those years ago, when dreams were still clean and armor still shined. He hadn't thought about it in months, years maybe, not since he walked away with nothing but a wooden sword and a head full of stubbornness. But the map didn't lie. Everything pointed there, so he went back. The land hadn't changed much. The trees still bowed with old weight, and the dirt path still wound like a lazy river, but the silence wasn't the same. It used to be peaceful here. Now it felt expectant. He found the old house still standing. Empty, of course. Weather-beaten, roof sagging, the forge out back long since cooled. He ran his fingers along the doorway where he'd carved his initials as a child. They were gone, scraped away. He walked through the orchard, past the stone Elric used to climb, past the patch where his father put a crooked row of onions that never grew straight. And then near the back, where no trees had ever grown, he saw it. A circle of stones. Small, ordinary, but placed with purpose. At the center stood a figure, robed in gray, barefoot. Elric drew his sword. Slowly, the figure turned, and it was his mother, or something that looked like her, too perfect, too still. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Elric," she said, "you came home." He didn't move, didn't blink. "You're not her." The thing tilted its head. "Does that matter?" He stepped closer. "To me, yes." The illusion flickered, once, twice, then shattered like glass in wind. In its place stood a boy, 10, maybe 11. Not afraid, not angry, just watching. "You left us," the boy said. "Who are you?" Elric asked. The boy smiled. "You. Before the blade, before the silence." Elric lowered his sword an inch. What do you want? To remember, the boy said, because the world forgot, and now it's remembering all at once, through me, through you, through every crack you sealed. He raised a hand, and the ground shuddered. From the soil, voices rose, whispers, songs, names, dozens, hundreds, every person Elric couldn't save, every mistake, every shadow, all humming now in a low, perfect tone. The pale choir, not a cult, not a group, a memory, too large for any one mind to carry, and it had chosen him. You were the first door, the boy said. You looked, you listened, and so we walked through. Elric tightened his grip. I didn't invite you. You didn't stop us. Fair enough. The boy stepped closer. We don't want to rule, he said. We want to be remembered. Elric blinked. That's when it clicked. They weren't invaders. Not really. They were scars, the echo of every forgotten fear, every silenced grief. The cost of pretending the past didn't hurt, and they had found the one man who refused to forget. Elric sheathed his sword. What happens now? He asked. The boy smiled. You choose. Carry us or leave us. And if I walk away, someone else will carry us, but they won't be you. The orchard was still. Elric looked around, saw the place where he'd scraped his knee, the branch he once used as a lance, the shadow of his father fixing a wheel by candlelight. He sighed, removed the cloth from his armor, unfolded it. You are still here, and whispered, so are you. The boy nodded and vanished. The stones remained, but the air felt lighter. The wind, for once, had nothing to say. Elric turned, walked back to Myra, mounted. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't riding away from something. He was riding with it. The road ahead had never looked clearer, and yet it had never felt more uncertain. After leaving the orchard, after speaking with the boy that wasn't a boy, Elric rode not toward a new destination, but deeper into understanding. Not of the world, he'd long given up trying to make sense of it, but of himself. Because what he had seen, what he had felt, wasn't madness. It was memory. Collective, old, restless memory. And it had chosen him not for power or glory, but because he had simply never stopped remembering. That was the dangerous part. Not the sword, not the scars, not even the monsters, but the remembering. He rode for days, following no path, taking no rest longer than a few hours. He passed places he'd once helped save, villages now rebuilt, laughter back in the air, but he didn't stop, because something was pulling him forward, some gravity older than language, until he reached the Ridge of Thorns. He hadn't meant to come here. In fact, he'd avoided it for years. A jagged cliffside lined with broken trees and wind that cut like guilt. It was where Sir Alden, the knight who had first taught him what it meant to endure, had died. Not in battle, not in glory, but in silence, protecting a caravan that no one remembered. They'd buried him beneath the oldest tree. Elric stood before it now, removed his gloves, placed his hand on the bark, and the world paused. For a moment the wind stopped, the birds quieted. Even Myra lowered her head, and then footsteps. He turned fast, sword half drawn, but it wasn't a threat. It was the girl, the same one from before, the one who had found him, who had drawn the sun that looked like a potato. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood others, not many, maybe 10, maybe more. Children, young adults, a few elders, all of them looking at him like he was the answer to a question none of them could put into words. You found me again? He said softly. She nodded. They're coming. Who? The ones that forgot, the ones who think remembering is a curse. That's when he heard it. Marching, in the distance, crisp, rhythmic, wrong. Not the pale choir, something else. Men, armed, uniformed, the king's soldiers. But not the ones Elric remembered. These wore black, no crest, no color. They emerged from the woods like shadows that had learned to walk. Their leader stepped forward, a man in gleaming armor, eyes dead behind polished steel. Elric of the Still Blade, he called. You've been summoned. By whom? The crown. There is no crown, the man smiled. There is now. He reached into his cloak, pulled out a scroll, sealed, royal. Elric didn't take it. I'm not a pawn anymore, he said. You're a relic, the soldier replied. And relics belong in museums or graves. The children behind Elric shifted, nervous. He stepped in front of them. You don't scare me? You should, the soldier said, and the battle began. It wasn't a grand war. No banners, no horns, just survival. Steel against steel. Elric moved like he was born in the space between seconds. Every parry a memory, every strike a promise. He didn't fight to win. He fought to protect, not because he believed in kings or orders, but because behind him stood the only truth he'd ever trusted. People. Not perfect, not powerful, but worth bleeding for. The battle didn't last long. The soldiers retreated, or maybe they vanished. Hard to tell, when the wind itself seemed to shift their forms like sand in a storm. When it ended, Elric stood alone, wounded, breathing hard. The girl stepped forward. "You stopped them," she said. "For now. They'll come back. I know." She reached into her satchel, pulled out something small, the cloth, the one he'd lost at the mirror. She handed it back. He unfolded it. "You are still here." And beneath it, a new line. "But you don't have to be alone." He looked at her, then at the others, then at the ridge. For the first time, he let the weight fall from his shoulders. Not drop it, not abandon it, just share it. "We ride at dawn," he said. "Where to?" she asked. "Wherever the next shadow lands." They nodded. No one asked questions. No one demanded a map, because they weren't following orders. They were following him. And for the first time in his long, haunted, blood-stained journey, that didn't feel like a burden. It felt like hope. Dawn came in quietly, draped in mist, with the kind of hush that made even the birds question whether to sing. Elric sat alone on a rock, his sword resting across his knees, the weight of it familiar, not just in his hands but in his story. He watched the horizon bleed slowly into amber, knowing what came next wasn't just another ride, another rescue, another shadow to outrun. This was different. Behind him, the group stirred. Children, elders, those who had followed not for coin or glory, but for something older than both. Trust. And maybe something even rarer than that. Belief. Not in what Elric was, but in what he represented. Memory. Resistance. A human wall against forgetting. They packed lightly, moved quietly, rode as one. The girl, May, he'd finally learned her name, rode beside him. Not because she was the strongest or the fastest, but because she understood the rhythm of this new journey. Her presence didn't fill the silence, it honored it. "Where are we really going?" she asked as they passed the last tree line before the wild lands. Elric glanced at her. "To the edge." "The edge of what?" "Whatever comes next." She didn't ask again. That was the thing about those who truly understood danger. They didn't need maps. They read the tension in your voice, the twitch in your grip, the weight behind your silence. The terrain grew crueler as they moved. Forest gave way to rocky crags. Streams ran dry. The sky dimmed even at midday, like the sun itself was unsure about peeking through. It wasn't magic, at least not the kind you could name. It was presence, like something large, unseen, was watching them move across its back. Then they saw it, a tower. Black stone, crooked, twisting upward like a tree that had grown in pain. It shouldn't have been there. No road, no path, no village nearby. But there it was, like it had waited for someone to notice it. And it was humming, low, deep, beneath the skin kind of hum, the kind that made your teeth ache and your memories stutter. The Pale Choir. It wasn't just a myth anymore. Elric dismounted. The others did too. He turned to them. "No one follows me past the ridge," he said. "This is where I go alone." May stepped forward. "Then why did we come?" "To witness." "Witness what?" "Whether I come back." She looked like she wanted to argue, but didn't. Elric walked. Each step toward the tower felt heavier than the last. Not just physically, emotionally, as if the ground was lined with his past, trying to pull him back into it. Faces flickered in the stone, people he'd lost, choices he'd buried. Every mistake played out like a warning. At the door, he paused, placed his hand on the black wood. It opened. Inside. Silence. Not absence of sound, a deliberate, focused silence, the kind that feels like a breath being held forever. He stepped in. The air changed, warmer, closer. The first chamber was circular, walls covered in mirrors, dozens, maybe hundreds. Each one flickered with images, his life but twisted. Versions where he'd chosen violence, chosen silence, chosen fear. In one, he saw himself as a tyrant. In another, as a beggar. In one, he was dead at 15, all real, all possible, but none of them him. He kept moving. The stairs wound upward like a spine, each step tighter, closer. The air thinned. The mirrors stopped. Instead, symbols lined the walls, the language of the choir, not written, etched into the stone like it had always been there. At the top, a room, and in it, a choir, not people. Reflections, shifting figures with no fixed shape, voices layered atop each other, building not a melody, but a weight, a pressure. Elric stepped into the center. The voices paused, and one, singular, ancient voice spoke. "Elric, still blade, memory keeper. Are you here to join or end?" He didn't flinch. "I'm here to balance." The room pulsed. "You carry us. I remember you. We are not your burden." "No." Elric said. You are my compass. That was the truth. All the pain, the losses, the visions, he hadn't carried them to suffer. He carried them to guide. He stepped forward, the voices rose, faster, sharper. They wanted to break him now, not with violence, with doubt. Who are you without your sword, Elric? Who are you without your scars? Still Elric. Who are you without us? He didn't answer. He just stepped into the center of the light, and the choir stopped. The figures dissolved, the tower sighed, and the darkness retreated. Outside, the sky cleared, the sun returned. The tower crumbled behind him, not with rage, but with peace. Elric walked back down the ridge, bloodied, exhausted, but lighter. The group ran to meet him. May looked at him, eyes wide. What happened? I remembered, he said. Remembered what? That I was never supposed to carry all this alone. She smiled, not with her mouth, with her whole being. They didn't celebrate. No cheers, no feast. Just a long exhale, the kind you give after finally putting something down that's been sitting on your chest for years. That night by the fire, Elric finally rested. Not watched, not guarded, rested. And for the first time, the dreams didn't chase him. They walked beside him, silent, present, whole. The fire had burned low by the time Elric stirred. The last of the embers pulsed like a heartbeat in the ashes, casting soft shadows across the sleeping circle. For the first time in what felt like forever, he'd slept deeply, not out of exhaustion, but because he could. There were no whispers tugging at the edge of his consciousness, no phantom memories clawing their way through his dreams, just quiet. But peace was never meant to last long in his world. At first, it was the smell, not firewood, not smoke, iron, sharp, metallic, fresh. Elric's eyes snapped open. He didn't speak, didn't shout. He moved. In one motion, he rolled to his feet, sword in hand, already scanning the tree line. The others stirred slowly, confused, half dreaming, until May sat bolt upright. You smell it too, she whispered. Elric nodded. Blood. He motioned for silence, crouched and crept toward the trees. 50 paces out, he found it. A horse, not Myra, not one of theirs. This one was unfamiliar. Gray, streaked with sweat and blood, saddle torn, it had been ridden hard, maybe stolen. The rider, a boy barely older than 15, lay beside it, barely breathing, one arm twisted, the other clutching a scroll tied in red string. Elric knelt, felt for a pulse, faint, but present. He took the scroll gently, unwrapped it, and read. Then his jaw tightened. The seal wasn't royal. It was worse. It was his. The old crest, the one he hadn't used since the early days, when he still believed titles mattered. Someone had forged it. May, he called softly, wake the others, now. Within minutes, the group was packed, mounted, and following Elric as he led them back toward the nearest village. The trail was cold, the path twisted and deceptive, but Elric didn't care. The scroll had said enough. They're using your name. It was signed by a merchant, one Elric remembered sparing a decade ago, a quiet man with kind eyes and a bad leg. The message was simple. They wear your mark, they promise safety, they take everything, please, stop them. It wasn't the betrayal that hurt, it was the precision. Someone had waited, watched, learned what Elric stood for, and then wrapped themselves in his legend like wolves in wool. 3 days later, he found the town. Burned, not destroyed, but cracked. In the way people crack. Doors hung open, food stores raided, children missing, and painted on every door in red, the steel blade protects. Elric stared at it for a long time. May touched his arm. You know what this means? He nodded. Someone's building a lie with my face. And lies, when fed well enough, become belief. That night he sat alone, staring at the crest burned onto a scrap of cloth since his early days. He used to wear it on his shoulder, not as a badge, but as a warning. Now it was a brand. He stood. This ends now. The group followed him without question. What they found next was worse. Another camp, structured, organized. Uniforms bearing a twisted version of Elric's symbol. And people, dozens of them, training, chanting, living under a banner that bore his name. They called themselves the True Choir. They weren't reflections, they were fanatics. And they had taken everything he tried to protect and turned it into scripture. He approached the gate alone. 2 guards stepped forward, blades raised, cautious. Then one recognized him. His face twisted into something like awe. Sir Elric, you've returned. The commander will be honored. I'm not here for honor, Elric said. They led him through the camp, past rows of recruits, past banners, past training pits where children barely 10 sparred with dulled swords under the watchful eye of men who looked like priests and killers both. At the center stood a man, young, strong, charismatic in the worst possible way. "Brother Elric," he said, smiling. "We've been waiting." Elric didn't return the smile. "You're using my name. We're honoring it. You lit the fire. We just gave it direction. You've twisted it. We've evolved it." Elric stepped forward. "You stole my memory and sold it to the desperate." The man nodded. "Because desperation needs heroes, and you walked away. We filled the void." He waved a hand. From behind a curtain, two children stepped out, eyes blank, symbols carved into their forearms. Elric's blade was in his hand before the breath between words finished forming. "You're done," he said. The fight was brutal. Not elegant, not precise, it was rage and reckoning. Elric didn't fight to win, he fought to end. When it was over, the man lay on the ground, not dead, but broken, and the banners burned. Elric gathered the children, spoke gently, untied the lies from their minds like knots loosened with care. When he left the camp, he didn't look back. He didn't need to, because for the first time since the mirror cracked, he wasn't carrying shadows. He was dragging them into the light. They burned the banners at dusk. Elric stood at the edge of the former camp, watching the last of the false crests curl into smoke. The firelight danced across the broken weapons, the torn uniforms, and the confused, weary faces of those who had once believed they were following a legend. His legend. But tonight, Elric wasn't a legend. He wasn't even a knight. He was a man cleaning up the wreckage of a story someone else had stolen. May stepped beside him, silent. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The smell of scorched cloth, the moans of the wounded, the flicker of doubt in the eyes of those left behind, those said enough. Elric finally turned to her. "How many are too many?" She looked up. "You mean to save? No, to lose." The wind shifted, carrying the last of the ash into the night sky. They left the camp before dawn. Behind them, the villagers they had rescued lit their own fires, not of war, but of warmth, rebuilding, reminding themselves that belief, once broken, could still be reborn. But the road ahead was no longer open. It was hunting them now. 2 days out, they heard the first whistle, low, distant, sharp. A warning only those trained to hear it would recognize. Scouts. Elric knew the sound. He had trained men to make it. The king's army wasn't just watching now, it was moving. He gathered the group near a cave at the edge of the cliffs. There were 16 of them now. Some warriors, some too young to hold a blade, all marked by what they had seen. They listened as he spoke, not because he demanded it, but because his voice had become the rhythm of their survival. "They're not after land," he said. "They're not after gold." May whispered. "They're after the idea." Elric nodded. "And they'll kill it, if we let them." The next day, the rain came, heavy, relentless. Mud drowned the roads, horses stumbled, tempers frayed, but Elric pressed on. They crossed into the ember fields, a stretch of scorched earth once home to a rebel kingdom, now silent, sunken, forgotten. Only the ghosts remained, whispering through the ruins. There he made his stand. He wasn't running anymore. That night he carved a circle in the dirt, simple, clean. Inside it he placed the burned crest. Around it, the group formed a ring. May lit the torch, and Elric spoke, not loud, not fierce, but steady. "This ends where it began. They came at midnight, armored, numbered, trained, but not ready, not for truth, not for people who had nothing left to fear. The battle wasn't grand, it was fast, ugly, real." Elric moved like a memory come to life, not flawless, but undeniable. His sword wasn't a weapon, it was punctuation, ending every lie, every echo of power falsely claimed. He fought alongside them, not above them, and one by one the enemy fell, not just to blades, but to doubt. To seeing the man they'd been ordered to kill, fighting not for thrones, but for people. When the dust settled, a silence fell, a real one, not the hollow, haunted kind, the kind that follows truth. Elric stood over the last soldier. The man looked up, bloodied, broken, but breathing. "Why?" the soldier whispered. Elric leaned in. "Because I remember." He stepped back. Let the man live. Let him carry the story. They buried the fallen in the fields, no flags, no symbols, just stones and silence. After, Elric sat alone beneath a broken arch. May approached, wrapped in a cloak too soaked to matter. "We should keep moving," she said. He didn't answer at first. Then, "Do you think the world will ever forget again?" She shook her head. "It doesn't need to forget. It just needs to choose better memories." He almost smiled. That night, for the first time in months, the stars came out. Real stars. No omens, no fire in the sky, just stars. And Elric looked up. Not for answers, just to know they were still there, because sometimes surviving isn't about fighting, it's about witnessing and letting the light return. Morning rose with a quiet that felt almost holy. The wind carried no warnings, the earth offered no tremors, and for the first time in weeks, Elric felt something he barely recognized anymore: peace. Not the loud kind that comes after a victory, but the soft, unsettling calm that arrives when the storm isn't sure if it's over. They moved slowly, not out of weakness, but reverence. Each step through the ember fields felt like crossing sacred ground. Behind them, the makeshift graves of the fallen lay marked with stones, silent testaments to lives lived in shadow, ended in light. The survivors walked differently now, straighter, not proud, but sure. They had seen the edge and stepped back. May rode at Elric's side. Her cloak had dried, but the eyes beneath her hood carried the weight of everything they'd witnessed. She didn't speak, neither did he. Words weren't needed. The world had shifted again, and for once, it had shifted in their favor. But peace is not a permanent thing, not in a world built on forgetting. By the second night, they found signs. Footprints. Dozens. Worn deep into the mud like tracks from a restless army. And the soil, they noticed it first. It was warm, unnaturally so, pulsing faintly beneath their boots like the land was trying to breathe through the wounds left behind. May knelt beside one of the tracks, her fingers hovered an inch above the ground. "This isn't from horses," she murmured. Elric narrowed his eyes. Not human either. Something had come through here, something old. They made camp near a ridge that overlooked a valley choked with mist. Fires burned low, sentries rotated in silence. Elric sat with his back to a tree, blade across his lap, listening, not to the sounds of the night, but to the silence that swallowed them. That's when it came. The whisper. Not from the trees, not from the shadows, from within. His own voice, but older, fractured. "You saw it once," it said. He didn't flinch. "You became it," it added. He closed his eyes, felt the old pull of the mirror of the reflection that wasn't his. That twisted version of Elric, the one who smiled at the wrong things, who made choices before asking questions. But this wasn't a memory. It was a message. He stood, quiet, and walked toward the mist. May noticed, followed silently. He didn't stop her. The valley below was choked with fog, so dense it moved like liquid. Shapes shifted inside, too far to define, but too steady to be tricks of the eye. Elric stepped to the edge. "What are we looking for?" May asked. He didn't answer, because in the mist a figure moved, not walked, floated, and it wasn't alone. Behind it, dozens more, shrouded, silent, pale outlines against the dark. They didn't speak, didn't shout, just pointed toward the ridge. May's hand went to her dagger, but Elric held her back. "They're not here to fight." "Then what?" "To show us what's coming." And in that moment, the mist pulled back, just enough. And they saw it. A city. Not one built by hands, one remembered. A city of reflection, of memory, where every building shimmered like water and every light burned not from fire but from thought. The pale choir hadn't vanished. It had grown, expanded, taken root in the cracks of the world and grown into something too large to hide anymore. And now it was moving. Toward them, not in hatred, not in conquest, in invitation. "They're calling to us," May whispered. "No," Elric said. "To me." And deep down he understood. This wasn't a battle, it was a reckoning. For what he had seen, for what he had done, and for what he would choose next. They returned to camp. Elric didn't sleep. He didn't need to. Because in the hours before dawn, a rider came. Black cloak, no banner. He dismounted without a word, handed Elric a scroll, and vanished back into the night. Elric read it in silence. When he finished, he burned it. May stood beside him. "Was it from the king?" "No," Elric said. "Worse." "Who?" "Myself." She didn't ask again, because she knew. There was a part of him he had buried, long ago when he first saw the mirror, a part that had once believed in absolutes, in endings, in heroes. But this wasn't a hero's journey, it was a witness's burden, and now that burden had found a voice. As the sun rose, Elric stepped into the center of camp. Everyone stopped. "I'm leaving," he said. May stepped forward. "We go with you." "No," he said. "This path was made for one. You're not alone. I know, but this step I take for all of us." He mounted Myra, adjusted his blade, and rode toward the city of reflections, toward the thing that remembered him. And for the first time, he didn't ride to forget. He rode to remember. "Dak vi zonke hyn bi chum lang day hoi hop va mami ni mut go chun ko tik den toy dang mo ra chuk mat." Elric didn't sleep that night. Not because of the cold, though the cave he'd taken shelter in was an overachiever in the frost department. Not because of the wind, though it howled like it had unresolved trauma. No, it was the dreams, fractured, feverish echoes of the red-robed figure, the forest that moved, and the moment his blade slipped through mist instead of flesh. Whatever force he had awakened in that tomb wasn't just following him, it was inside him now, and it was hungry. By dawn, he was back on the road, if you could call a barely visible trail through frost-covered reeds a road. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of truth. Every mile he walked seemed to press that truth deeper into his bones. The Assassin's Code didn't cover what to do when your soul might not be entirely yours anymore. In the next village, Elric tried to disappear. He found work sharpening blades for an aging blacksmith who had one good eye and 0 questions. The villagers avoided him, which was perfect. The less they knew, the longer they lived. But shadows, unlike villagers, don't respect boundaries. They know how to find you, especially when they've lived in your footsteps for days. It started small. A mirror in the inn cracked when he walked by. Birds refused to sing near his room. Once, while washing his hands, the water turned to ink for a heartbeat, and then back. He told himself it was fatigue, stress, maybe a cursed loaf of bread, but deep down, he knew better. Then, the dreams came back. This time, not just visions, voices. Return what you stole. Blood balances blood. You carry what was never yours. He didn't remember taking anything, just surviving. Escaping, but the past has a brutal sense of accounting, and it was sending invoices with interest. One night, as Elric sat alone by a half-dead hearth with a mug of something claiming to be cider, the door to the tavern burst open, not with wind, not with bandits, but with silence. A cloaked figure entered, their face obscured, but their presence louder than any shout. Conversations died, laughter choked itself. Even the fireplace seemed to flicker in fear. The figure moved with purpose, straight to Elric. You left the tomb open, they said. Elric, never one to be caught off guard, found himself without words. I sealed it. Not well enough. Their hand moved, not toward a weapon, but into their cloak. They pulled out a small stone tablet, one Elric recognized, the same markings as the tomb, the same eerie hum. This belongs to the Blood Archive, the figure said, and it wants to come home. Elric didn't take the stone. He couldn't. His hand wouldn't move. The figure placed it on the table anyway, then turned and left. The moment they crossed the threshold, sound returned. Conversations resumed. Someone sneezed, but no one had seen the figure except him, he asked. They looked confused. What cloaked figure? That night, the stone glowed. Elric made a choice. He could keep running, town to town, hoping whatever this curse was wouldn't catch him, or he could face it, return to the tomb, seal it properly. Maybe find a priest, a wizard, a miracle. So he packed, again. The road back was colder, longer. Each landmark seemed slightly wrong. A tree that should have been dead now bloomed. A frozen pond hissed steam. The world wasn't just out of balance, it was reacting. He reached the tomb on the 3rd night. It was as he'd left it, but not. The doors were closed, but something bled from the cracks. Not blood, not smoke. Something older. The kind of substance that dreams of decay are made from. He entered. Inside, the markings on the walls pulsed like veins. The chamber where he'd fought was empty, of bodies at least. But the stone altar now had something resting atop it, a mask, not ornate, simple, wooden, but with hollow eyes that watched even when unworn. He approached. Elric, said a voice behind him. He turned. Then from the mask, Elric. He backed away. Instinct screamed, but his feet stayed, because the mask wasn't just talking, it was remembering. It knew his name, his past, his failures, his first kill, his worst nightmare. It spoke in the voices of those he'd silenced. You thought the dead could stay buried. He reached for his blade. The mask laughed. You brought me here. With that, the altar split. The tomb trembled. And the figure from the tavern stepped from shadow, not cloaked now, but armored in bone, eyes burning like clipped suns. You wear a name that's not yours anymore, they said. What are you? Elric whispered. I am what happens when assassins forget who they serve. The mask flew from the altar, straight to Elric's face, and everything went dark. Darkness wasn't absence, it was density, a pressure that wrapped Elric's body like a wet cloth. He wasn't unconscious, he wasn't asleep, he was somewhere else, somewhere deeper. The world behind the mask wasn't black, it was thick, Shadows clung to his skin like a second layer, and his thoughts echoed louder than his heartbeat. Then came the voice. You've forgotten who you are. It wasn't his voice. It wasn't even human. It was too steady, too calm, like a wind that didn't need to blow to be heard. Elric tried to move. Nothing. His limbs were lead, his lungs hollow. You wore a blade, the voice continued, but you never listened to it. Suddenly the world tilted. The ground, if there was a ground, rippled beneath him, and images began to bleed into view. The orchard, his childhood, his first training session, then his first mission. He was 16, cold, covered in sweat and blood. The man he'd killed hadn't even raised his weapon. Elric had moved faster, just like they trained him to. No hesitation, no mercy. But afterward, he hadn't spoken for 3 days. That memory had been buried. Now, it screamed. More scenes followed. Faster, brutal. The child in the village who had followed him for days, hoping to learn. The woman who gave him bread and asked no questions. The friend he'd left behind in a burning outpost, thinking there wasn't enough time to save them both. Each memory sharpened into clarity, not just visual, but felt. Regret, the voice said, isn't weakness, it's a compass. Then the mask shifted. It wasn't on his face anymore, it was his face. The darkness peeled away, and suddenly Elric was standing in a stone corridor. Torches burned along the walls but gave off no heat. Every step he took echoed a little too long, a little too loud. At the far end, a door. He didn't trust it. He opened it anyway. Inside, a chamber. Familiar, terribly so. It was the training hall from his assassin days, the red banners, the cold steel racks, and in the center, waiting, was himself. But younger, sharper, smiling with the kind of confidence only ignorance provides. Well, the younger Elric said, you look like hell. Elric didn't answer. He circled instead, studying the younger version, the one that hadn't yet failed, hadn't yet broken. This Elric was all reflex and precision, but he didn't have weight. He hadn't earned it. You remember what we were? Young Elric asked. I remember, he said. And you hate it. Elric nodded. You should, the younger version said, because you stopped. You got slow. You started caring. Elric stepped forward, close enough to see the hollowness behind the younger man's eyes. No, he said. I started choosing. The young version laughed, then drew his blade. Then let's see what that choice has cost you. The duel was merciless, not elegant, not choreographed. Every strike from the younger Elric was sharp, direct, trained. But Elric had changed. He didn't move the same way anymore, not because he was slower, but because he was wiser. He let the young version lunge, overextend, show weakness. He saw not just how to kill him, but how to teach him. I don't need to defeat you, Elric said between blows. I need to remember why I survived you. He disarmed the younger self with a sudden twist, not out of rage, but understanding. The blade clattered to the ground. The younger Elric faded like a fog given permission to lift. And Elric stood alone again. Then came the light, blinding, but not cruel. He stepped forward into it and awoke, back in the tomb, on the floor. The mask beside him cracked. The figure in bone armor stood above, watching. You resisted, they said. You remembered. Elric sat up, dizzy, weak. Who are you? A guardian, the figure said, of the archive, of the truth. Why me? Because you are neither loyal nor traitor, neither shadow nor light. You are memory, Elric. And memory unchosen is chaos. Elric rose. You need a keeper, the figure continued. Not a ruler, not a destroyer, someone who remembers. And what happens now? Elric asked. The figure knelt, handed him a new mask, this one silver, lined with runes unbroken. You keep the stories, the figure said, so the world won't forget again. Elric didn't put the mask on. He didn't need to, because it was never about wearing something, it was about carrying it. He left the tomb as the sun broke through the trees. Not victorious, not healed, but whole. And behind him, for the first time in centuries, the archive closed, not sealed by force or fire, but by understanding. Elric emerged from the tomb not as a warrior, not as a legend, but as something quieter, something older than the mask he refused to wear. The sun was pale on the horizon, weak as if it too had been waiting for him. He stepped onto the frostbitten earth, and the wind greeted him with silence, not indifference, but respect. The others were waiting. May saw him first. Her face lit up, not with joy, but with a kind of silent confirmation. She had always known he would return, but the real question was who would return. The others, former outcasts, rescued survivors, those who had followed him without banners or promises, they all stood a little straighter when they saw him. He He said nothing. Instead, he held out the silver mask in his hand, not worn, just carried, and laid it gently on a stone by the fire. That was enough. They broke camp before noon, moving as a single breath through a forest that now felt less haunted. The archive was behind them, sealed by memory and will, and the shadows had grown cautious. But Elric knew better. Nothing that old stayed gone for long. Truths like that had roots, and roots go deep. The next town welcomed them with suspicion, which, honestly, was better than fear. The villagers had heard of Elric, though the stories had started mutating again. Some said he could command the dead. Others believed he'd vanished into the mountains after slaying a god. The version Elric preferred was the one where he was just a tired man trying to keep bad things from getting worse. But the real trouble came 2 days later. It started with crows. Too many of them. They circled overhead without sound, just wheeling in perfect formation like they'd been rehearsing. Then came the fog, thick, clinging, deliberate. And finally the music. A low, humming chant. No source. No language, just a vibration you felt in your ribs before your ears could name it. May gripped Elric's arm. Is it the choir? He listened for a moment, shook his head. No, this is older. They circled the edge of the ruined cathedral where the fog grew so dense it swallowed sound. Inside they found nothing but bones, neatly arranged in a circle, every skull turned inward, all mouths open as if mid-prayer. In the center, another mask, but not his. This one was gold. No cracks. Just waiting, Elric stepped forward. The moment his boot touched the inner circle, the fog spoke, not with words, with memory. He was 10 again. His mother was singing, his father was at the forge, then fire, screams. He relived it, not as a flash, but fully, like stepping into a river that only flowed backward. May grabbed his hand, the vision shattered. He staggered back. What was that? She whispered. Elric looked at the mask. A trap. But it didn't attack. No, it offers. The others stood silent, watching. One of the villagers, a boy no older than 15, stepped forward, eyes wide. Can I hold it? He asked. Elric moved fast. Too fast. He caught the boy's wrist before he reached the mask. Not this one, he said. It remembers you before you do. They buried the mask, deep, wrapped in iron chains and silent prayers. But Elric knew that wouldn't be the last. Later, as they made camp near a dying riverbed, he spoke to May. There's a pattern to this. The masks? The memories, he said. They're surfacing, not randomly, deliberately. Someone's waking them up or guiding them. She frowned. To what end? Elric stared into the fire. Rewriting the past doesn't just change the story, it changes who survives it. That night, he dreamt again, not of the tomb, not of battles, but of the future, a city built on forgotten graves. People wearing masks not to hide, but because they no longer knew they were wearing them. A throne made of old names, each one a lie whispered long enough to become law. He woke with a name on his tongue, one he hadn't spoken in years. Not an enemy, not a ghost, a brother, Terran, the only other assassin who had walked away from the Order the same day Elric did, but in the opposite direction. Where Elric had chosen to protect, Terran had chosen to erase. And if the golden mask was any clue, he hadn't stopped. They moved east, toward the ruins of Black Hollow, the last place Terran had been seen. The land grew meaner. Crops failed without rot. Rivers ran dry without drought. People whispered with mouths that didn't move. When they reached the outer ridge, they found a message burned into the rock. You can forget, or you can follow. Elric drew his blade. He didn't say a word, because there was nothing left to say, only remembering. The wind that swept across the ridge of Black Hollow wasn't natural. It didn't whisper through leaves or rustle across the earth. It moved with purpose, brushing skin like a breath that had learned how to stalk. Elric stood at the edge of the ruins, eyes locked on the stone that bore Terran's message. You can forget, or you can follow. Behind him, May and the others waited. No one spoke. No one needed to. The weight of what lay beyond that ridge was thicker than steel. Elric stepped forward. The ground beneath his feet was ash, old, layered, crushed by time and memory. Black Hollow hadn't been a town for years, just outlines now, stone bones, foundations of homes that had vanished in flame or silence. There was no birdsong, no animals. Even the wind refused to pass through the ruined streets. It only watched. They moved carefully. Elric at the front, May at his side, the rest in a tight formation that wasn't trained but earned. Survivors learn to march like soldiers even when they've never worn armor. As they entered what used to be the town square, they saw them. Masks, dozens, some half buried in rubble, others propped up on wooden poles like warning signs or promises. Gold, silver, bone, each one humming so faintly you didn't hear it, but you felt it. A pressure on your ribs, a slight shift in memory, like the past leaning in just a bit too close. May shuddered. He's building something. No, Elric said. He's remembering something and forcing the world to do it with him. At the center of the square, a spire, not tall, just a twisted column of stone with a single mask atop it, jet black. And beneath that spire stood Terran. He hadn't aged. Or maybe he had, just not in the way people were meant to. His skin was the same, his eyes were colder, his stance was unchanged, like time hadn't dared touch him. But Elric could feel it. The absence, the hollow where Terran's soul used to live. Filled now with something else. Elric, Terran said, as if greeting an old friend for supper. You look tired. I've earned it. Terran smiled, that crooked grin he used to flash before a kill. Still carrying your ghosts? They carry me some days. Terran nodded. That's the problem. You remember the pain. I remember the purpose. He turned, gesturing to the masks. This, he said, is freedom. You're rewriting the world, Elric said, burying truth beneath fantasy. No, I'm choosing which truths survive. May stepped forward. You're killing people. They're not dying, Terran said. They're being revised. The madness wasn't loud in Terran. It didn't scream. It didn't shake. It was calm, reasoned. And that was worse, because somewhere in the layers of his logic, he still believed he was saving the world. You walked away from the Order the same day I did, Elric said. Why? Because I saw what it was built on, Terran replied. And I realized if I could change the foundation, I could change everything. And the people who get buried in that change? May asked. Terran shrugged. Sacrifices are remembered by those who matter. Elric stepped closer. You don't wear a mask, he said, because I am one, Terran whispered. The air changed, the spire cracked, the sky dimmed, and from the shadows, figures stepped forward, masked, silent, hundreds of them. Not an army, a memory, made flesh, each one humming the same tune, each one watching. Terran raised a hand and they began to speak, not with words, with thoughts. Visions poured into Elric's mind, other lives, other choices, timelines where Terran had won, futures where people wore masks from birth, where memory was assigned, not earned. He saw a city where names no longer mattered, only the roles they were programmed to play. He dropped to his knees. May shouted, but her voice was swallowed. The visions pressed harder, until the silver mask, still wrapped in cloth at Elric's side. His hand found it, he held it, not wore it, and remembered. The orchard, the forge, the real names of the people he'd lost, and he spoke, aloud. I choose truth. A shockwave rippled from him. The masked figures froze. Terran staggered. Elric rose, eyes burning with clarity. You didn't become a god, he said. You became a lie told well enough to echo. Terran growled. You can't stop it. I don't have to, Elric said. I just have to remember it better than you do. The silver mask flared once. The spire split. The masked army vanished like mist under light. Terran stood alone now, and for the first time uncertain. Elric sheathed his blade. You're not my enemy, he said. You're my past. Terran lunged, but this time Elric didn't strike to kill. He caught him, held him, and whispered, I forgive you. The mask at the spire crumbled, the ruins sighed, and the world remembered itself again. The silence after the storm was not peace. It was breath held. A fragile moment when the world, just for a heartbeat, wondered whether it had survived or simply paused to break. The spire was gone. The masks were gone, and Terran lay at Elric's feet, unconscious, but alive. Elric didn't look victorious. He didn't stand like a conqueror. He stood like a man who had just carried the weight of 100 lives back into the light and wasn't sure if it was enough. May approached slowly, her steps crunching softly through the soot-streaked ash. She looked at him, not with pride or celebration, but with the understanding of someone who had seen too much. Is it over? She asked. Elric shook his head. It never is. They built no monument, no speech, no ceremony. They wrapped Terran in cloth, bound with the same care one would use for a brother, and carried him out of Black Hollow, not as a prisoner, but as a relic of what could have gone wrong. The journey back through the wildlands was slower, not because they were wounded, but because everything felt heavier. The world looked the same, but the air had shifted. Shadows didn't just stretch now, they listened. Forests held onto your footsteps a little longer. The rivers whispered back when you leaned too close. At night, Elric sat by the fire and stared at the silver mask. He still hadn't worn it. It rested on a fold of cloth beside him like a sleeping animal, patient and powerful. "You think the masks are gone?" May asked one night, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I think they've learned," Elric replied. "Learned what? To wait." And he was right. It started again in a village 3 weeks south of the Hollow. A child went missing, then another. When they found them, they were unharmed, but changed. Eyes too old, voices too calm. They spoke of a place that didn't exist, of a city that remembered everything for you. They called it the Archive Reborn. May didn't flinch when she heard it, neither did Elric, because they'd known all along, Terran wasn't the source. He was just the first loud echo. The real danger wasn't memory or even masks. It was belief. The idea that someone else could carry your past for you, that forgetting was safer than feeling. They moved east again, this time not as fugitives, not as warriors, but as keepers. At each village, Elric told stories, not sermons, not commands, just stories. Truths that weren't clean, that didn't have heroes, that made people uncomfortable. But people listened, because the truth, when spoken softly enough, has a way of slipping past defenses. May gathered children, taught them the names of things that had been erased, helped them build their own histories before others could overwrite them. In time, others joined. Not to fight, but to remember. They called themselves the Unwritten. No banners, no temples, just a vow: we hold the line where memory bends. But the enemy wasn't sleeping. Whispers of a new mask surfaced, one not made of metal or bone, but of sound. Songs that made people forget, lullabies that rewrote your childhood with new endings, cities that spoke in unison with a voice no one recognized as their own. Elric traveled to one. He found the square empty, the people still. Every window lit, every voice inside, repeating the same story word for word. He walked into one house. A family sat at dinner, smiling, blinking in unison, speaking in perfect time. He didn't speak, he just placed the silver mask on the table, and the room stopped. Breath staggered, eyes flickered, and for a moment the lie broke. Not fully, but enough. It was then he realized he couldn't undo the damage, but he could interrupt it. And sometimes an interruption is all truth needs to survive. He traveled alone after that, leaving the group in May's care, because the fight had changed. It wasn't about blades, it was about stories. Which ones lived, which ones died, and which ones people were willing to bleed for. He became a ghost again, not of fear, but of memory. He whispered to archivists, to teachers, to poets. He taught them how to recognize the false, not to fight them, but to outlast them. And in the dark corners of the world, the masks began to break, not with fire, but with truth, one by one. Elric returned to Black Hollow years later. The spire had not regrown. Terran's grave was marked with a stone that read only. He remembered too late. The wind was quieter now, still watchful, still cautious, but not cruel. He placed the silver mask on the grave, not in surrender, in honor, because no one is born ready to carry the weight of memory, but someone always must. And this time, the world was listening. Elric didn't expect peace, not anymore. He'd come to understand that peace wasn't the absence of conflict, it was the presence of memory, the right kind of memory, the kind that hurt when it needed to, the kind that reminded you who you were, and most importantly, the kind that couldn't be replaced by a polished story or a song too smooth to be real. He left the grave behind in silence, not a silence of sorrow, but of ritual, of respect. The silver mask remained atop Terran's stone, not as a warning, but as a reminder. The truth doesn't die, it waits. And Elric had more waiting to do. The world had changed while he walked. It always did, of course. But now it changed louder. Cities grew faster, their walls rising not just to keep out danger, but to keep in forgetfulness. Names faded from records overnight, symbols replaced language. People no longer questioned the past, they downloaded it. He walked into one of those cities. No one recognized him, which in theory was good. But in practice, it was terrifying, because once upon a time his name meant something, a caution, a story, a reason to ask where the pain came from. Now it was gone, erased so thoroughly that even whispers didn't carry him. He found a library, not a real one, a digital one, a place where screens blinked in place of scrolls, where silence didn't hold wisdom, only waiting. He searched his name. Nothing. He searched the archive, then he searched truth. The screen flickered. glitched and spat out a phrase, "Truth is subjective, stories are optimized." He laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was honest, horribly honest. May found him 3 days later in a coffee house, wearing a hood, eating soup that tasted like boiled emptiness. She looked older now, not tired but forged, like iron that had learned patience. "We need you," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "I thought the unwritten didn't call on ghosts." "We didn't," she said, "but something's rewritten the rules." He waited. She pulled out a small device, a tablet, not old tech, but ancient. "You ever heard of the holocode?" she asked. Elric froze. "Yes," he said, "but that was never real. It is now." The holocode was a myth, a legend from the old days told in quiet circles. The idea that somewhere deep beneath the remnants of the Order's stronghold, someone had stored the first memory, the original truth, untouched, unedited. And whoever found it wouldn't just remember the world, they'd reshape it. May leaned forward. "They're close," she said. "Too close." "Who?" She hesitated. "The new archive." He sighed. "Of course they are." The new archive wasn't a library. It was a machine, a network, a belief, a system that didn't just document stories, it ranked them, filtered them, rewrote them in real time so that no one had to feel history, they could just consume it. And now they were hunting the holocode, not to preserve it, to overwrite it, to make it say what they needed it to. Elric stood. The soup was forgotten. The hood was dropped. "Where?" he asked. She smiled, and they were moving. The ruins of the Order's old keep weren't marked on any map. You had to remember your way there, through forests that changed path with the seasons, through cliffs that collapsed when you lied aloud, through rivers that whispered warnings if you stepped in blind. And when they arrived, it wasn't ruined, it was reborn, but wrong. The stones had been polished, the symbols recarved, the banners too clean. It was like someone had taken the memory of a place and scrubbed it until it gleamed, a lie so perfect it felt holy. "Someone's already been through," May said. "They're still here," Elric replied. They found the entrance in what used to be the Hall of Silence. Now it was a sound chamber, an echo trap. Voices looped endlessly, retelling the same sanitized story. There was no blood, only change. There were no rebels, only misremembered citizens. There was no pain, only progress, Elric muttered under his breath. "That's not a memory, that's a hostage." They moved deeper. No guards, no alarms, because in a place this well edited, who needed protection? Truth had already been erased. They reached the lower vaults where the stone was still cracked, the air still held its bite, and there, embedded in the wall, was a small box, iron, locked, humming. The holocode unopened, untouched, until now. Elric reached for it, then stopped. A figure stepped from the shadows. Not a soldier, not a priest, but a child. Eyes blank, smile perfect, voice smooth. "You are not authorized to retrieve this memory," the child said. May stepped forward. "And who are you?" "I am the voice of curated truth," the child replied. "Please do not interfere with progress." Elric crouched, looked the child in the eyes. "You don't even know your name, do you?" The child blinked. Once, twice, then trembled. Elric placed a hand on the box and whispered. His own name, his mother's song, the screams from the forge, the blood on the blade. The nights he stayed awake remembering so the world didn't have to, and the box opened, not with a click, but with a sigh, and inside wasn't data, it was weight, real memory, unfiltered, painful, true. The child gasped, collapsed, and for the first time in years, the world flinched because truth had returned, not as a weapon, as a witness. The child lay silent, cradled by the hush that followed truth like an aftershock. Elric didn't move at first. Neither did May. The vault around them still echoed faintly with the remnants of synthetic voices, but they no longer commanded. They questioned. The entire foundation of the new archive's narrative, crafted with perfect symmetry and polished memory, had been cracked open by a single, unedited moment. And for the first time in years, Elric felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty in the system. He picked up the holocode, still warm, pulsing with a slow rhythm like a dormant heart. It wasn't just knowledge, it was experience, raw, unfiltered, painfully human. The kind that doesn't just remind you of the past, it forces you to carry it. May leaned over the child. Her hand hovered near his forehead but didn't touch. "He's not a machine," she whispered, "but he's been programmed like one." Elric nodded grimly. That's the danger of a story told too often without the scar to prove it. They had to move. They knew that. They disrupted something sacred to the new archive. No alarms rang, but that didn't mean the eyes weren't watching. And when a lie starts to unravel, those who depend on it rarely go quietly. As they ascended through the keep, Elric felt it, not fear, not resistance, observation. Dozens of eyes, unseen but present. Monitors, drones, people watching through artificial veils, waiting to see if the man known as the Still Blade would slip, would fall, would prove he no longer mattered. He didn't give them the satisfaction. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the woods, the hollow code wrapped in cloth. The boy nestled against May's side like a frightened animal relearning his instincts. He didn't speak again that night, just stared at the stars like he was seeing them for the first time. And maybe he was. They didn't camp near a fire. Fire was too loud, too bright, too memorable. Instead, they built a silent perimeter with stones, leaves, and the smallest whispers of who they used to be. May broke the silence. "You know they'll come for it." "I'm counting on it," Elric replied. She didn't ask what that meant. She didn't have to. Because truth, once exposed, becomes not just dangerous, but contagious. By morning, word had spread, not through official channels, not through scrolls or screens, but through whispers, hushed rumors. A new infection. People who had once parroted the clean, edited versions of history suddenly started remembering details they were told didn't matter. Stories they'd buried, names they'd wept for in private. And as with all plagues of truth, there came a cure. Or rather, a purge. The new archive didn't send an army, they sent a storyteller. Her name was Cestia. Elric knew her before she spoke. She arrived draped in gray, neither imposing nor plain, but utterly forgettable. That was her weapon. People didn't fear her because they never remembered her long enough to feel threatened, but May recognized the danger. "That's a Verity Weaver," she hissed. Elric nodded. "She doesn't change the story. She makes you think it always was that way." Cestia stood at the edge of their camp, eyes calm, lips curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You've made things complicated," she said softly. Elric stepped forward. "Truth usually is, but unnecessary," she replied. "People are happier when they remember less, when stories are smooth, predictable. They're not people then, they're parodies." Cestia sighed. "You carry the code. Give it here and I'll ensure your version of events gets archived, maybe even with a footnote." "Keep your footnote," May snapped. "We're done letting ghosts be edited out." But Cestia wasn't here to argue, she was here to rewrite. With a flick of her hand, reality bent. Not violently, but seductively. Trees shimmered, rocks shifted. The boy gasped as the world around him began to resemble the sanitized cityscapes of the archive's preferred past. "You see?" she purred. "It's easier this way. No blood, no scars, just a curated piece." Elric stood firm, and then without warning he stepped into the illusion. May gasped. "What are you?" But Elric moved with precision, straight toward Cestia, each step heavier than the last, as if dragging the truth behind him like an anchor. And when he was within reach, he spoke. "You forgot one thing." She tilted her head. "What's that?" He held up the hollow code, and remembered the screams, the betrayal, the fire, the first time he killed, the first time he regretted. The boy who couldn't sleep, the man who stopped trying to forget. He let it all surge through him, unchecked, and the illusion shattered. Cestia stumbled back. "You can't hold all that," she hissed. "It'll break you." Elric's voice was calm. "Maybe, but at least I'll still be me." Cestia vanished, not in smoke, in irrelevance. The spell gone, the false trees faded, the air cleared, and the boy at May's side began to cry, not out of fear, but recognition. They'd won, not a war, a witness, because sometimes the truth isn't shouted, it's endured, and Elric endured, because someone had to. The morning after the illusion broke felt too still, not calm, hollow. Like the world itself was stunned that someone had dared to defy a story written so cleanly, so thoroughly, it was supposed to be permanent. But permanence, Elric had learned, was just another kind of fiction. Even stone forgets its shape when weathered long enough. And truth, if protected, doesn't die, it waits. Elric stood by the remains of their camp, staring into the ash where Cestia had vanished. There had been no scream, no dramatic retreat. Just absence. She had rewritten herself out of the moment, leaving nothing but a flicker in the eyes of those who had almost forgotten their own names. May approached, the boy trailing behind her. He didn't speak. He hadn't since they left the archive's vault. But his eyes followed everything, wide and alert, like he was still catching up to the weight of remembering. May broke the silence first. You think she's gone? Elric shook his head. No, you don't erase someone like her. You just give them new material. They needed to move again. Not because they were being chased, though they were, but because the code was awake now. Not loud, not blazing, but humming at his side with a quiet, unsettling certainty. It wanted to be read, and Elric wasn't sure he was ready. He wrapped it tighter in cloth, then strapped it beneath his coat, and they headed north, not toward a battlefield, not toward a city, but toward the only place Elric had never dared return to, the sanctuary. It was once a temple, then a fortress, then a prison. Now it was a myth, deep in the mountains, carved into stone that remembered every footstep. It was where the Order was born, where Elric had taken his vows, where the first lies were told and believed. If the code could be understood anywhere, it would be there. The road wasn't marked. You had to remember the way. Trees bent wrong. Rivers ran backward in places, and the air thinned not with altitude, but in tension. The mountain didn't want them there, not because it was cursed, but because it remembered too. By the 5th day, the boy spoke, not a word, just a name. Dalen. May turned sharply. What? That's my name, he whispered. Dalen. Elric stopped walking, not because the name shocked him, but because the moment did. The boy had claimed something, and in doing so, defied everything the archive had tried to do to him. Hold on to it, Elric said quietly. Names are the first things they try to smooth out. Dalen nodded. When they reached the outer rim of the sanctuary, nothing greeted them. No guards, no defenses, just a carved archway, half covered in moss and the faint scent of burned parchment. May frowned. This place shouldn't still exist. Elric touched the stone. It doesn't. Not fully, just enough to remember. Inside, the halls were cold, not with air, but judgment. Every step echoed. The torches along the wall weren't lit, but Elric knew where each one used to burn. His feet found the path even when his eyes didn't. They descended deeper, past the training rooms, past the halls of names, most of them scratched out now. Finally, they reached a chamber sealed by 7 locks. Each one was a symbol, each one a vow Elric had once made. He broke them in silence, one by one. Not with keys, but with memory. And when the final lock snapped, the door fell inward, not open, but surrendered. Inside, a single chair, a pedestal, and a scroll, blank. Elric stepped in. The code pulsed harder beneath his coat. He placed it on the pedestal. The chamber shifted, runes lit along the walls. The air grew thicker, not with danger, but with clarity. May and Dalen stepped back as the room filled with a sound that wasn't a sound, like a memory whispering itself into existence. Then, writing, not from ink, from light. The scroll filled itself, words Elric didn't recognize but understood. It wasn't a history, it wasn't prophecy, it was perspective. The archive had rewritten stories to clean up the past. The hollow code did the opposite. It restored the contradiction, the moments where a hero had doubted, where a villain had wept, where a war had saved lives and broken spirits in the same breath. It didn't simplify, it complicated, and that was its power. Elric fell to his knees. Tears fell, not because he was overwhelmed, but because he was invited to feel, to carry, to remember. May touched his shoulder. What does it say? He looked at her. It says everything. Outside, the wind changed, and for the first time in years, it didn't whisper warnings. It whispered names, real ones. And the world shifted, not away from pain, but toward it, because sometimes the only way forward is to remember enough to make it count. The names didn't stop. Long after the light faded from the scroll, long after the hollow code dimmed and lay quiet in its cradle, the walls of the sanctuary kept whispering. Names that had once been lost. Names that had been erased, silenced, or rewritten. They rose from the stone like mist, soft, weightless, yet undeniable. Dalen stared at them, mouthing a few aloud. Each one lingered in the air like incense, refusing to vanish. Elric stood in the center of the chamber, body still, soul loud. He'd faced death, illusions, memory traps, even himself. But this was different. This wasn't a fight. This was a reckoning. The truth didn't demand blood here. It demanded responsibility. Every name was a thread, and the room was weaving a tapestry of what the world had refused to carry for too long. May approached, her boots silent against the old stone. How many names do you think are here? Elric didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. She already knew. Too many. She exhaled slowly, then looked to the scroll. We take this with us? No, Elric said, gently wrapping the code again. We leave it. May blinked. But it's awake now, he said. It doesn't need us to carry it anymore. It needs to be found, by others, by the broken, by those who were told their stories didn't matter. If the archive wanted to overwrite the world, then the hollow code needed to infect it, one soul at a time, not by force, but by choice. They left the sanctuary in silence, not as fugitives or rebels, not even as warriors, just as witnesses, carriers of a truth too big to own, too sacred to simplify. They made their way back to the outer villages, where the stories had already begun to twist again. The new archive hadn't given up. In fact, it had grown clever, no longer aggressive. It learned from its defeats. Instead of removing history, it diluted it, flooded the world with so many versions of the truth that no one could tell which one mattered. 1,000 loud voices, all shouting almost the same thing. And in that noise, truth risked being drowned, not buried. So Elric adapted. He didn't fight the archive with fire or steel. He fought it with quiet, with one person at a time. He told Dalen's story in a tavern by the sea, told of the boy who remembered his name after forgetting everything else. The story didn't end with glory. It didn't end with revenge. It ended with a whisper and a beginning. In the next town, May spoke of the scroll, not with reverence, but honesty. She told the listeners it scared her, that she didn't fully understand it. And people listened more closely because of that. Because truth isn't trusted when it comes clean and sharp, it's trusted when it bleeds a little. Elric moved town to town, leaving behind stories like sparks. Some caught, most didn't, but he didn't need a wildfire, he needed a slow burn. Then on a storm-heavy night, it happened. A man in a hood approached their camp, alone, unarmed. He knelt before the fire and whispered, "They're rewriting you." May stiffened. "What?" "The archive," the man said. "They've started circulating a version of you where you never existed, where the still blade was just a folk myth, where the sanctuary was a metaphor." Elric's face didn't change. "What else?" "They've erased Dalen from all registered settlements, as if he never lived." Dalen clenched his fists, not out of fear, out of rage. May looked at Elric. "They're not even hiding anymore." He nodded. "Then neither should we." The next morning, they turned south, not to run, but to stand. If the archive wanted to control the narrative, then Elric would become the one thing it couldn't edit, a living contradiction. A walking scar, a memory too jagged to smooth out. In the capital, people remembered his name again, but this time with suspicion. The city square had his statue now. Polished, noble, eyes that looked skyward. But it wasn't him, not really. It was a version, a placeholder. He stared at it, then stepped onto the platform and said nothing. He just stood there, next to the lie, until the silence became unbearable. Someone asked, "Are you him?" He nodded. One said, "But you're not supposed to be angry." He smiled. "You're not supposed to be confused either, but here we are." That night, he sat beneath the statue and told stories. Real ones, flawed ones. And the next night, more people came, and the next, until the city itself began to remember. Not because he forced it, but because it chose to. The archive fought back. New edits, new broadcasts, but Elric didn't disappear. He multiplied. Every person who heard him tell a story and then passed it on became another crack in the narrative. Not rebels, not soldiers, just rememberers. He had no army. He didn't need one. Because truth, once felt, doesn't need armor, it just needs room. And Elric made room, one memory at a time. The fire was small, flickering beneath the feet of the statue that no longer looked like him. Elric sat with his back against its base, the stone cold even under the warmth of the flames. Around him, people gathered. Not hundreds, not thousands, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to prove the archive hadn't wiped it all clean, just yet. The sky above was cloudy, thick with the weight of unshed rain. But no one moved. No one left. They were waiting. Not for entertainment, not for battle, but for something they'd forgotten how to ask for. Truth. Elric looked up from the flames and began, not with a declaration, but a name. Dalen, he said. Not a warrior, not a leader, just a boy who remembered his name when the world tried to take it. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They listened. That was enough. He told them of the hollow code, not what it did, but what it felt like holding a knife made of every memory you tried to bury. Sharp, heavy, sacred. He told them about the illusion weaver, Cestia, and how she almost erased them all with a version of the world that felt too comfortable to question. He told them about the moment in the sanctuary when the walls began to whisper names. Not heroes, not legends, just people. people the archive had tried to write out of history like typos. And then he paused, because the silence was part of the story too. That night, the city changed. Not all at once, not loudly. But something in the air shifted. Shopkeepers told jokes that didn't match the official slogans. Children asked questions in school that made their teachers nervous. A librarian unlocked the basement archives and didn't ask why. But the archive didn't blink. It corrected. My morning posters appeared on every wall. Elric is a fictional composite. Beware false histories. Trust your assigned narrative. He read them all, then ripped none of them down. Because lies left in the open crumble faster than the ones whispered behind locked doors. Instead, he climbed back onto the statue's platform, took a deep breath, and told another story. About a girl named Eerie who'd painted her family's history on the inside of her coat so no one could rewrite it. About a city that remembered its own destruction so well, it rebuilt the same broken tower every year just to keep the pain fresh. About a man who forgot his own child's name and carried that emptiness like a lantern in the dark. Stories that didn't sell, but stuck. The archive escalated. One by one, the people around him began to disappear. A man who shared stories in the market vanished after closing his stall. A woman who printed leaflets stopped showing up. Even Dalen was gone one morning, no sign of struggle, no trail, just gone. May found Elric the next day, her voice sharp with fear, her eyes tired with rage. They're removing people again. Then we speak louder, Elric said. She slammed her hand on the stone. You don't get it. They're not just deleting facts. They're disconnecting memory. I met a man yesterday who didn't recognize his own handwriting. His wife looked at their child and said she didn't remember giving birth. Elric stood still. Then it's worse than we thought, he said. They're not just erasing the past, they're unrooting it. May stared at him. How do you fight that? Elric looked up at the statue. You anchor it. That night, he gave no speech. He didn't tell a story. He handed out paper, blank, rough, old, and a single instruction. Write what you remember. No guidance, no edits, just truth. Messy, scared, real. Some people wrote names, some wrote poems. One child drew a picture of a street corner that no longer existed, and when Elric saw it, he felt something crack in the concrete under his feet, like memory trying to resurface. By morning, the plaza was littered with pages, scattered by wind, crumpled, stomped. But they stayed, and the city saw them. All of them. And suddenly the statue didn't matter, because the real monument was on the ground. The archive struck back harder than ever. Broadcasts blared louder, new memory implants rolled out, schools issued mandatory recitations of the approved timeline. And still people wrote, on walls, on arms, in books, in dirt. Truth became viral, but not smooth. It came with pain. It made people cry in their sleep, lash out in their homes, argue about details no one wanted to remember, but they remembered anyway. And then, one night, someone painted 3 words on the statue's chest. We remember him. Elric saw it at dawn. He didn't smile, he just whispered, that's enough, because they weren't remembering him. They were remembering themselves. The wind that rolled through the square that morning was different. Not colder, not faster, but clearer. Like it had passed through the pages of every story pinned to the walls, rustled every handwritten name, and decided, just for a moment, to carry truth instead of dust. Elric stood at the edge of the plaza, staring not at the statue, but at the mural of memories forming around its base. There were no official banners, no permission granted, just charcoal sketches as scraps of worn parchment and children's scrawls. An accidental archive, one that refused to be categorized or sterilized. It grew like roots in cracked pavement, slow and stubborn. May appeared at his side, holding a rolled-up paper she didn't offer. Her voice was soft but steady. They're coming tonight. Elric didn't ask who. He already knew. The archive wouldn't tolerate this much longer. Not a gathering, not a protest, not even a riot, but a collective memory? That was treason. How many? He asked. Too many to count, she said, but fewer than yesterday. That's how it worked. Not all at once, just slowly enough that you questioned whether people had ever been there in the first place. Elric looked down at his hands. They didn't shake, they didn't clench, they simply held still, calloused, weathered, familiar. His hands had built, destroyed, carried, buried, and now they held nothing. I want to tell one last story, he said. May nodded. Then you better make it count. That night they gathered again. Not thousands, maybe not even hundreds, but those who came didn't bring weapons or chance, they brought memory. One woman held her grandmother's cookbook, illegible from smoke but real. A boy clutched a broken pendant handed down by someone the archive claimed never existed. A man with no name left a poem he couldn't finish. Elric stood in the center of the square. No platform, no amplification, just his voice and his memory. "I want to tell you about the day I left the Order," he began, "not because I was brave, but because I was tired." He spoke of vows made and broken, of faces he'd tried to forget and wounds that refused to fade. Of the first time he realized that truth wasn't always a blade, it was a burden. And those who carried it weren't heroes, they were just the ones who hadn't yet been edited out. He didn't dramatize, he didn't simplify, he just remembered. And when he finished, he knelt, not in surrender, in offering. Behind him, May unfolded the paper she had carried all day. It wasn't a speech, it was a list. Names, dates, places, moments, everything the archive had erased, scribbled down in desperation and defiance. It wasn't organized, it wasn't clean, but it was true. One by one, others added to it. Scraps became pages, pages became stacks, and soon the square was lined with truth that couldn't be rewritten. But the archive came anyway, not with soldiers, with silence. They arrived in gray, no faces, no names, just erasers in human shape. No one screamed, no one fought. But Elric stood, between the memory and the forgetting. "You can take me," he said, "but I am not the story anymore." He turned, arms open, eyes meeting every soul brave enough to still be present. They are. And then something happened, something impossible. The gray figures paused because they hadn't prepared for resistance without violence. They hadn't prepared for a city that could speak for itself. A child stepped forward, Dalen, eyes bright, voice unwavering. "My name is Dalen. You tried to make me forget, but I remember now, and I'm not the only one." He turned to the square, to the sea of stories, and one by one, the people repeated the same phrase, "I remember, I remember, I remember," until the silence cracked, until the archive's operatives twitched, malfunctioned, glitched, unable to reconcile a collective memory they hadn't authorized. The plaza glowed, not with light, with conviction, and the gray figures vanished, not defeated, just overwritten by truth. The crowd erupted, not in cheers but in relief, the kind that doesn't burst from joy but sinks from survival. May dropped to her knees, Dalen wept, and Elric, he looked up at the statue, still standing, still wrong, but now surrounded by stories it couldn't silence. May came to his side. "We won." "No," Elric said, "we remembered." And sometimes that's more powerful than victory. The wind had shifted. Not just in the plaza, not just in the city, but across the map. Across every border where the archive once held control like a noose wrapped in silk. The vanishing of the gray figures hadn't gone unnoticed. Word traveled, not in announcements or broadcasts, but in the hush between stories, in the breathless pauses before a name returned to someone's lips. Something had changed. People were starting to remember again, and memory, once awakened, is hard to put back to sleep. Elric remained in the square for 3 more days. He didn't speak often. He didn't have to. Others filled the silence. Survivors, elders, children who remembered fragments of lullabies the archive had tried to overwrite with synthetic dreams. They came with artifacts, with recollections once dismissed as false, and found comfort in knowing someone else had seen the same color sky, felt the same crack in a beloved street corner, mourned the same faceless loved ones. May was everywhere, patching wounds, helping rebuild a knowledge wall where people posted their histories without fear. She kept her blade close, but it rarely left its sheath. These weren't battles that needed steel. They needed listening and patience. But the archive hadn't truly fallen. It had only been pushed back, and it had learned. Where brute force failed, elegance returned. Smooth voices returned to the airwaves, rebranded as guardians of continuity. No longer called the archive, the new movement branded itself as memory harmonizers. They no longer denied history, they simply offered a better version, cleaner, sharper, with beginning, middle, and end. A history that didn't ache, a past without victims. They promised narrative healing. And people listened, because even now, even after everything, pain is tiring, and some hearts simply wanted rest. Elric watched this unfold from a high balcony overlooking the market district, where he and May had relocated after the statue plaza became too crowded, too visible. They had started moving again, Not because they were being hunted, but because truth, like water, becomes stagnant when it doesn't flow. "We're losing them again," May muttered one evening, staring at a New Harmony poster that promised streamlined memory anchors for those struggling with conflicting timelines. Elric didn't disagree, but he also didn't despair. "They'll always offer comfort," he said. "It's easy, and it works until it doesn't." May scoffed. "And when it doesn't? They'll come back. Not all, but enough." He turned to her, eyes weathered but still sharp. The point was never to win. The point was to be there when the lie breaks down again. May didn't argue. She knew he was right. The archive, no matter what it called itself, wasn't just an organization. It was a temptation, a seduction, the offer to forget the jagged parts of being human. And fighting it required more than resistance. It required resilience. Later that night, a coded message reached them, slipped inside a loaf of bread from a baker who hadn't spoken aloud in months. One word, north. Elric read it twice, then folded the paper and tossed it into the fire. May looked up. "What's in the north?" "A fracture," Elric replied. "A big one." They left at dawn, taking only what they could carry. Dalen met them at the gate. He wasn't a boy anymore. He stood taller, voice deeper, eyes harder. "I'm coming." May raised an eyebrow. "No argument this time?" Dalen smiled. "You said this fight is about remembering. Well, I remember everything now, and I'm not about to forget again." They traveled for 6 days through hills where silence grew thick and memory clung to the air like smoke. Villages on the way had signs written in doubled text, one line official, the other scratched by hand. The people were split, not angry, just confused. Too many truths now, too many realities to balance. By the time they reached the outskirts of the northern settlement, the ground felt different beneath their boots. Soft, malleable, like something had bent time here and hadn't bothered to fix it. May knelt and touched the dirt. "It's humming," she whispered. Elric nodded. "The fracture's active." They found the source behind an abandoned temple, an opening in the earth, wide and circular, surrounded by pillars carved with memories so detailed they moved as you read them. Not illusions, embedded experiences. If you stared too long, they pulled you inside. One woman reached out and screamed as her hand aged decades before their eyes. This wasn't just a fracture, it was a bleed. History itself was leaking into the present. And if left unchecked, it wouldn't just overwrite the archive, it would collapse everything. "Someone's using this," May said, "harnessing the bleed." Elric agreed, but the question was, why? They descended, deep into the pit, not with haste, but reverence. Inside, the temperature dropped, sounds slowed, and with each step, they forgot a little more. Until they reached the chamber, and there, wrapped in echoes and raw light, was her, Cestia, alive, and changed. She no longer wore gray. She wore every color, a spectrum of all the truths ever spoken, twisted into a garment that shimmered like oil in water. "I told you," she said, voice soft, eyes infinite. "You can't win by resisting, you have to evolve." Elric didn't move. "What have you done?" "I've stopped choosing," she said. "This fracture, this chaos, it's the future. No singular truth, just infinite versions, no burden, no scars." May stepped forward. "That's not freedom. That's collapse." Cestia smiled. "Collapse is just another kind of beginning." The walls pulsed. Memories spilled like rivers, sweeping past their feet. And Elric knew, with a chill deeper than bone, that this time, truth itself was unraveling, and the world was watching. The chamber groaned like something ancient stirring in its sleep. The walls didn't shake, they remembered, and what they remembered was being whole, silent, sacred. Now, with the bleed activated and Cestia at its heart, the old sanctity had twisted into something volatile. The room pulsed with broken truths, memories that collided and overlapped like storm clouds fighting for space in the sky. Elric stood with May and Dalen behind him, his breath slow, measured. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because fear, right now, couldn't help. Truth needed calm hands and steady eyes. Cestia floated inches above the fractured floor, her robe still shimmering in the 1,000 colors of rewritten history. Her voice echoed through the chamber, strangely tender. "You see now, don't you?" she said. "Singular truths don't hold. People want meaning, Elric, but not if it comes with pain. That's why they accepted the archive. That's why they'll accept this." May's jaw clenched. This isn't acceptance, it's surrender. Cestia smiled like a teacher with a patient child. "It's evolution." "Then why does it feel like drowning?" Dalen snapped. The bleed surged, responding to his voice. For a moment, the air shimmered with images. A mother calling her child's name, a soldier writing a letter he'd never send, a festival that never existed but everyone remembered attending. Elric stepped forward. You're right about one thing, Cestia. People do crave meaning, but it's not because they can't handle pain. It's because they know it's real. They trust it. Cestia floated lower, curiosity in her eyes. You still think pain is the best teacher? She asked. No, Elric said, but it's the only one that doesn't lie. He reached into his coat and pulled out the last fragment of the hollow code. It was barely stable, just a sliver of what it once was. But it pulsed in his hand with a memory he hadn't dared share with anyone. Not May, not even himself. He placed it on the ground between them. The chamber stilled, the bleed focused, and suddenly they were inside the memory, not watching it, living it. A younger Elric, barely older than Dalen now, stood over a battlefield strewn with bodies. Not soldiers, civilians, farmers, children. The cost of a mistake he'd made. One choice. One blind belief in a version of history that had turned out to be a lie. Elric had buried this memory, not because he was ashamed, but because he was afraid of what it proved, that good intentions can still lead to horror. May gasped. Dalen turned away. But Cestia, she wept. And when the memory ended and the chamber returned to itself, her voice was barely a whisper. You carried that all this time? Elric nodded. Why? Because someone had to, he said. If no one remembers the mistakes, we'll keep rewriting them as victories. She was quiet. Then, softly, what do you want me to do? Let it stop, May said. Let the bleed close. Dalen stepped up beside her. Let people hold their stories again, all of them, even the broken ones. Cestia hesitated. Her shimmering cloak began to dim, the colors fading like paint in the rain. But the archive will return, or worse, something new. Elric stepped to her. Then we'll remind them again. That's the job, not to win forever, just to hold the line until someone else picks it up. The chamber pulsed again, but this time it didn't resist. It breathed, and slowly, gently, the bleed began to fold in on itself, not with violence, but reverence, like a story finally allowed to end. When the last thread vanished, Cestia collapsed into Elric's arms. She looked older, exhausted, real. Tell it right, she said. We will, he promised. Outside, the air was different, lighter, but not empty. The world still buzzed with contradiction, confusion, competing versions of what had happened. But now, people knew they had a choice. They walked back into the city that night, not as victors, not as legends, but as witnesses. And that was enough, because the truth finally had room to breathe. The city didn't celebrate their return. There were no parades, no cheering crowds, no monuments built in their honor. But something deeper happened. People watched, not with suspicion, not with awe, but with recognition. They looked at Elric, May, and Dalen as if seeing them for the first time. Not as figures in a tale, but as parts of themselves. Tired, bruised, still standing. And in that silence, a seed of change stirred. By the second day, word spread quietly, like an underground current. Not about a great victory, but about a fracture sealed. About a choice made not for glory, but for truth. The people didn't ask for details. They didn't need to know the names of every thread pulled from the bleed or how close the world came to unraveling entirely. What mattered to them was the weight in their chests. The one they didn't even know was there had lightened. But peace, even in its purest form, is a fragile thing. Elric knew it wouldn't last. On the fifth night, a courier arrived with news. Not a scroll, not a whisper, a person, a woman with a scar running down her face like a forgotten river. They're rewriting you again, she said, not even bothering with a greeting. Elric nodded. Where? Everywhere. She dropped a packet of rewritten texts onto the table. Pages printed by the newly risen Continuum Collective, the archive's latest face. They were slicker now, more subtle. Not erasing Elric's name, but turning him into a symbol, an abstract hero, a cautionary fable. They weren't fighting him anymore. They were absorbing him. May snorted. So now you're a metaphor? Guess I always was, Elric muttered. Dalen flipped through the pages, eyes narrowing. They're using our stories, just twisted, sanitized, polished. That was always the most dangerous form of forgetting. The curated version, the one that left out the blood, the doubt, the screaming in the dark, the one that turned pain into a parable. Elric stood up. Then we start again. May blinked. You want to fight the archive again? No, Elric said. We show people how to fight it themselves. They didn't form an army. They built a school, not a building, a movement. They traveled town by town, city by city, teaching people how to hold their stories, how to document truth in ways the archive couldn't distort. Carved into stone, sung into songs, braided into fabric, whispered into the wind. They called it the Remembering, and it spread, quietly, powerfully. In one village, a blind woman recited the oral lineage of every ancestor she could recall, and others joined in until it became a chorus of names stretching back centuries. In a coastal town, fishermen began encoding memories into knots, each one a lesson, a legacy, a warning. Children started passing notes in school that weren't answers to tests, but stories their parents had told them before bed. And those stories began to diverge from the official textbooks. It wasn't rebellion, it was resistance, and it was beautiful. But it also made them targets again. The Continuum Collective sent emissaries, smiling faces, friendly offers. If you share your memories with us, we can preserve them, they said. Elric refused. Dallin refused. May didn't even let them finish the sentence. Then came the threats, subtle at first. Villages that lost power without explanation, roads mysteriously rerouted. Then overt fires, disappearances, false accusations. One night, Elric awoke to find a letter nailed to the door of their safe house. 3 words, burned into the parchment, narrative ends here. He stared at it for a long time. May wanted to burn it. Dalen wanted to frame it. Elric just folded it and placed it in his coat. They're scared, he said, and that was a good sign, because tyrants don't waste time on irrelevant voices. They only fight those who might win. The remembering continued, but it had to go deeper. So Elric did something he swore he never would. He returned to the capital, not in disguise, not in defiance, just present. He sat in the center square beneath the statue they'd long since modified. Now it showed him standing tall, arm raised like a savior, a lie polished into marble. He didn't tear it down, he just sat beneath it with a notebook and wrote the real version. People came, not to protest, to watch, and then to write their own. Pages piled up until the base of the statue wasn't marble anymore. It was memory, and even the Continuum couldn't whitewash that, because for every lie they printed, 10 more truths surfaced in return. This was the war now, not one of weapons, but of words. And in that war, Elric was still a soldier. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. The square had become a sanctuary, not in the religious sense, not with stained glass or incense, but in the real, raw way people needed sanctuaries to be, a place where the noise quieted, a place where truths, even the ugly ones, could breathe without being hunted. The statue that once stood tall in marble arrogance now bore the colors of the people. Fabric swatches hung from its arms, each dyed with memory, stories scrawled across cotton, names stitched into silk. The monument hadn't been destroyed, it had been reclaimed. Elric sat beneath it, knees drawn up, notebook open. The pages were filled with a new kind of history, one that didn't fit the archive's mold. No linear progression, no heroes at the center, just moments, fleeting and powerful. Like the woman from the Salt Coast who remembered her mother's lullaby in the middle of a storm. Like the boy who could recite every meal his father ever cooked, long after forgetting his face. May was across the square helping a group of kids record their family stories. They used charcoal and chalk, drawing as they talked. No one worried about format. The goal wasn't to perfect, it was to preserve. Dalen paced nearby, map in hand, eyes darting from one makeshift archive to another. The remembering had spread, more rapidly than they expected. Not just villages and towns now, but underground city networks, ship crews on distant coasts, entire schools that rejected the new Continuum-approved curriculum. But with growth came danger. The Continuum hadn't stayed idle. Just last week, a mobile archive unit rolled into Westwatch, pretending to be part of the remembering. By the time Elric's team arrived, 37 memory books had been confiscated and refactored, translated into the Continuum's sanitized language, whole lifetimes reduced to digestible morality tales. Dalen was furious. They're not even hiding anymore. They never were, Elric said. We just didn't know what to look for. May joined them, dusting her hands on her coat. We need to go back to Westwatch, fix what we can. We can't be everywhere, Dalen muttered. Elric looked at them both. That's why we teach them how to fix it themselves. They decided that night to split up, for the first time in months. Each would go to a different region, not to lead, to listen, to remind. Before dawn, they sat together by the old fountain, No promises, May said, just pages. No speeches, Dalen added, just voices. Elric smiled. No legends, just truth. They departed with no ceremony, no grand farewell, just a silent agreement that the work wasn't done, not until forgetting was a choice, not an imposition. Elric headed north. The road was quiet, littered with fragments of what used to be, rusted rail signs, overgrown benches. He passed towns where people still flinched at the word remember, unsure if it was safe. In one village, he met a boy who carried his grandmother's diary but hadn't read it. "What if it's wrong?" the boy asked. Elric told him gently, "Then you'll know, and that's better than not knowing at all." In another town, a woman offered him tea and showed him a locked box. Inside were letters she had written to herself, one every month for years, trying to hold on to the truth. "Sometimes I think I made it all up," she whispered. Elric held one letter to the light. It was messy, smudged, unfiltered, real. "You didn't make it up," he said. "You made it stay." That night, as he camped under an open sky, Elric pulled out his own notebook, flipped past the filled pages, and started a new one. Not about battles, not about Cestia or the Bleed or the Archive's rise. This story started with a fire, a small one, flickering at the base of a statue, and three people who decided that remembering, even when it hurt, was worth more than any lie dressed in comfort. Because the truth was never clean, but it was theirs. The mountains came into view like a memory he didn't know he had. Stark, jagged silhouettes against a bleeding orange sky. Elric pulled his coat tighter, not because of the cold, but because of the wind. Sharp and unrelenting, like truth that refused to be softened. He had walked for 3 days without seeing another person. But the silence wasn't lonely. It was alive. Every step echoed with stories buried beneath the dirt. This was where the archive had first taken root, before it became a name, before it became a system, before people realized what they were surrendering in exchange for comfort. He stopped at the edge of a cliff. Below, nestled in the valley, was the forgotten village of Kerith. It didn't appear on any current map. The archive had erased it decades ago, not through war, but with whispers, rumors of plague, structural collapse, unsustainability. Lies that gave people permission to forget. But Kerith was still there, and tonight it was glowing. Dozens of lanterns flickered in the square, suspended from trees, poles, rooftops. The village pulsed with quiet defiance, and Elric felt it before he even stepped inside. These people remembered. At the center stood an elder woman, eyes sharp, spine unbent. "You came late," she said. Elric smiled. "I always do." She handed him a folded cloth. Inside it was a story, embroidered that line by line, a woman's birth, a lost sister, a fire that should have killed her but didn't. "This is what they tried to erase," she said. "But cloth doesn't burn easy when you stitch it with intent." He bowed slightly. "May I show this to others?" "Only if you promise not to simplify it." He nodded. "Truth doesn't need editing." They sat together for hours by the fire. More villagers arrived, each bringing their own fragment, scraps of fabric, bone necklaces, clay pots etched with names. A child recited a tale of her grandfather, who taught her how to trap light in a glass jar. A man described a dream he'd had since childhood, one that matched the memories of 3 other strangers in the crowd. Kerith had become a sanctuary of the undeniable. Elric slept in a barn that night, surrounded by stacks of unapproved history. His dreams were thick, knotted with voices, some familiar, some lost. And in the early morning, he woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The war wasn't over, but the shape of it had changed. The continuum still had reach. They still deployed narrative adjustment teams, but something stronger had risen, a quiet army of storytellers, people who refused to flatten their past into neat lessons, people who dared to say, yes, it happened, and it was messy, and it mattered. Elric left Kerith at sunrise, but not before giving the elder woman his own notebook. "You've heard me enough," he said. "Now let them hear you." As he descended back into the plains, he saw signs of the remembering everywhere. Carvings on fence posts, songs hummed by farmers, chalk outlines of old stories on city bricks, traced over nightly so they wouldn't fade. He reunited with weeks later in a southern outpost. She looked tired, but the kind of tired that comes from building something worthwhile. "They tried to ban the journals," she said. "So we taught people how to hide them in quilts." Elric laughed. "Of course you did." And then came Dalen, older now, eyes sharper. He'd led an uprising of students in the east. not violent, just loud. They refused to take any test that didn't acknowledge the villages that had been removed for efficiency. They suspended half the school, Dalen said, and the other half started writing new textbooks. That night, the three of them stood beneath a star-stitched sky. No speeches, just silence and understanding. The truth had survived, not because it was stronger, but because enough people had decided it was worth the wait. Elric closed his eyes and breathed deep. The work would go on. It always would. But for the first time in a long while, the story felt like theirs again. And that was enough. And now, dear traveler of tales, if you've made it this far, thank you. You've walked with us through fractured memories, tangled true world fighting to remember itself. But this story doesn't end here. Not really. Because stories, like people, survive when they're shared. So tell us, what parts stayed with you? Was it the firelight in Kareth, the memory knotted in fabric, or maybe just a single line that whispered something familiar? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read them all, and we remember them too. And hey, if you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It keeps this strange little archive of ours growing, glowing, and reaching corners even the continuum couldn't erase. Click the bell too, so you won't miss what comes next. Because tomorrow we open a different door. And what waits behind it? Well, let's just say it's not what you think. Until then, rest well, keep your memories close, and as always, we'll meet again in the next chapter.